In this course, we're going to be building out the snippets.codecourse.com site together completely from scratch. Now, just a bit of background on this and exactly what it does. I recently came across a problem where I was following instructions for things that I had learned, and I was storing these notes either in email, I was storing them in different applications, and really I just wanted a simple place that I could come and create a code snippet with lots of different steps. So this is exactly what we're building here. Regardless of whether you actually want to build this, there's a huge amount going on in this. It's a very simple application, but there is lots to learn. So I'm going to give you a quick demo of it. This is the live site as it stands at the moment, but we're going to come over and I'm just going to demo exactly what we can do with this and some of the technology that we're going to be learning and using along the way as well. So the site is built in two stages. We have an API and a Nuxt client. So if you are learning Vue.js and you want to check out Nuxt, or if you want to improve your Nuxt skills, then we're going to be using Nuxt and Laravel in combination. And let's just start as a signed out user here. So of course we can start to browse snippets. There are none here at the moment on my local environment. We'll go ahead and create one. And we can also search as well. We'll get to that a little bit later because this is slightly more advanced than just a standard Algolia search. So let's go ahead and sign in. You can of course create an account just over here, but we're just going to sign in with my details and we can head straight over to my dashboard where of course I have no snippets either. So let's create a really simple snippet in here. You'll notice that we're booted into a kind of editor-like page. Now, this is exactly how the snippet will look when it is live. So once we start to fill out the title, the step titles, the step body, see our step preview, this will be live and it will look exactly the same. Okay, so let's go ahead and just create an example snippet. So I'm going to enter the title in here. And let's just do step 1 for now. We'll just keep things boring. Now you notice that the steps at the side as well are kept up to date with whatever you type in here. And we can navigate through each of the steps as well, either using our keyboard or we can just click on each of these steps. Now this editor here looks quite simple, but it is actually a code editor. So I can go ahead and write out code in here. I can tab over. You can do pretty much whatever you want in terms of writing out code here. And Markdown is also supported as well. So we can say something like Markdown. And of course you can see that in the step preview here, we instantly see exactly what this is going to give us. So if I did want to write some PHP code in here, I could of course go ahead and do so. And you'll see that all keeps up to date, including syntax highlighting as well. So this is probably the most advanced part. It looks very, very simple, but we have a code editor that shows us a Markdown preview, and it also includes syntax highlighting as well. Now, the other reason this is a little bit more advanced than it looks is we have these navigation items here. We're specifically going to look at ordering these so we can kind of insert things before or after each of the steps that we've created. So let's just create 2 more steps in here. So I've got step 2 here. I can fill that out, and I've got step 3 here as well. Now, if I wanted to insert a step before step 2, that may sound very simple, but in the database, this can actually get pretty complicated. So of course, just clicking this plus button here will insert a step before here. And just for the sake of messing around, let's call it step 1.5. So of course, we can navigate between steps using these arrows as well. And if I just press Control Shift and left right on my keyboard, you can see that we can navigate between these two, and everything is kept nicely up to date, including the URL. So when we hit back on a step, it gives us everything that we need. So we'll just keep this as it is. Let's just add any old content in here, just so we've got something to see. And we don't need to save this. So everything that we've done at this point is saved. Of course, we can delete steps as well. So let's just delete that step there, and you can see that that gets rid of it. Now, everything, like I said, is saved. So we don't need to click a save button. The title is updated when we update it. Each of the steps are updated as we type, so we don't need to worry about clicking a save button. The only thing that we can do is make the snippet public, which we'll look at in just a moment. So once I've done, I can just head straight back over to my dashboard, and you can see that we've got that example snippet. At the moment it's private. Of course, we can edit this, go back into that editor view. We can delete this with a confirmation. But more importantly, we can click on it and actually see this. So obviously you're familiar with this screen now. it looks exactly the same as when we were editing the step. So I can again navigate through each of the steps. I can go ahead and use my keyboard to do this if I want to, and I can only see this edit button because of course I own the snippet, but clicking this will jump straight into the part that we're currently looking at, or the step that we're currently looking at, and we can just make really quick edits to that, not have to worry about clicking a save button, and just navigate away. So if we just head back over to the home page, notice that there are no snippets still. That is because by default all snippets that we create are private. So to make these public, just tick this. That will go ahead and update that. And you may have noticed this last saved tag here. That just tells you when it was last saved, so you know that it is actually being saved. It's just more of a visual confirmation. So now that I've marked this snippet as public and I head back over to the home page, you can see that this snippet is now showing up. I can click on my profile page, it tells me when I joined, and it shows me all of my public snippets, or shows everyone all of my public snippets. I can also browse as well. We don't have pagination and stuff in here just yet. We can get to that a little bit later on. But more importantly, more interestingly, is the search. Now, of course, I can go ahead and start searching and I will see the snippets appear. So I'll see this example snippet. Anyone can see that snippet now because of course it's public. But the problem that we have is what happens if this is not a public snippet. So we're going to be looking at generating an Algolia key. So when we go ahead and do start searching for something that isn't public, it will not give us the results back. We're not hiding these results, we're just not allowing them to be seen by anyone unless they are public. So you can go ahead and not add confidential information in snippets, but if you just want snippets for yourself and you don't want other people to see them, you can be sure that they will not be shown under your search section. So that's pretty much it, to be honest. The only other thing that we can do is delete a snippet. This does seem very simple, like I've said, but there is a lot going on here. We need to think about the reusability of this entire template. We need to think about how we're going to manage state management. And a little clue, we're not actually using Vuex here at all. There's no need to use Vuex because the state management is actually quite simple, but we need to think about how we handle that in terms of showing our steps and all of the reusability here between this page and the actual page itself that we view the snippet on. So there's a huge amount to cover here. Even if you don't want to build a code snippet site like this, you are sure to learn lots along the way. So let's head over, get Nuxt and Laravel set up so we can start building this entire app out from scratch. Let's focus on just getting Nuxt and Laravel both set up and running so we can start using Laravel to build our API and of course Nuxt to build our client. Now I'm using Vagrant for the API, and of course with the Nuxt client we're just going to be running this using the npm run dev command. And if you've not worked with Nuxt before, don't worry, I'll explain exactly how we install and get this set up now. So let's come over to the Nuxt website. Let's head over to the Get Started section, and under the installation section here you'll find instructions to create a new project. Now what I've done over on the command line is I've created a separate snippets directory to store both the client and the API, and for the Nuxt project we're going to create this just with the folder name client, and that's as simple as running that command, waiting for this to finish and having a brand new Nuxt project ready to go. If you've not used Nuxt before and you have used Vue before, Nuxt is a server-side rendered or by default server-side rendered framework for Vue, which just makes it a little bit easier to set up server-side rendered applications, which is what we want because we want the SEO benefit of web search crawlers. Okay, so let's fill in a couple of bits of information here. I'm not really going to fill this in properly. You can do, of course. Really importantly, I'm going to choose NPM as my package manager. It's just my preferred. And for the UI framework, we are going to be using Tailwind for this, but we don't actually want to install it with the scaffolding here. We're going to do this manually, and I'll explain why a little bit later. We're not going to choose a custom server framework, and we do want to pull Axios in. We can forget it for now and do that later if we want to, or we can pull it in and have it ready to go. And we don't want to enable PWA support just yet. We're not going to worry about linting, and we're not going to install a test framework, and we're going to choose the universal server-side rendered option here. And of course we are Can choose a development tool if we want, but we don't have to. So let's just wait for the npm packages to install and we can move on to booting this up. Okay, great. So let's cd into the client directory now that this is finished, and let's run npm run dev. So this is the development environment. When we want to build this and launch this for production, we'll use npm run build and start, but we just want this for development just at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up in the browser just here, and you can see that that app is building, and sure enough we have a new Nuxt project set up and ready to go. Really, really simple. Now let's come over to the editor because I just want to tidy this up a little bit. By default we've got lots of style scaffolding in here, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of that because we're not going to need any of that. We're not going to need that logo either, so we can get rid of that. And we can also get rid of some of this markup as well. So let's get rid of the markup in here and just write home. We're going to keep this class of container because we are going to use that to contain the site, but for now that will just about do. So if we come over to the layouts, the default layout again includes more styling in here, including fonts and stuff. We don't want any of that because we're going to be using Tailwind and a custom font from Google Fonts API. So that is our Nuxt project setup. Really, really simple, and we can just start building pages now and making requests to our API. Speaking of our API, we want to go over to Homestead, whatever you are using to run Laravel locally, and as well as this client folder, we now want to go ahead and create a Laravel project. So let's install Laravel, and you'll probably have guessed we're going to call this API. So let's just wait for everything to download and we'll get this all set up, and I'll show you my Vagrant or Homestead setup as well so you know how to get this working. Great, so the installation of Laravel is finished. Let's hop into the API directory so we can continue working on that. If I just open up a new tab here and cd over to Homestead, I'm going to go ahead and open the Homestead YAML file just to show you how I've set this up. You can see here that I've got a snippets API.test site, which is going into the tutorial snippets API directory, and of course pointing to public as well. And what I've also done is set this up over in Etsy hosts. So if we code over to Etsy hosts, you can see that I've got this set up here as well. So the API URL is snippetsapi.test. And let's just talk about Postman, because this is going to be really helpful when we are developing with this. If we send a GET request over to snippetsapi.test, we should see that Laravel welcome screen. And let's just get rid of the HTTPS here, and that should be on port 8000. There we go, great. So we get the Laravel standard screen when we install this. So if you're not already using Postman, go ahead and download this. It's very, very easy to use. There's a couple of things that you also want to do along with developing with an API is set the accept header in Laravel. If you don't, you'll get some funny responses. So we're going to set the accept header to application JSON, and when we send requests and get JSON response back, we will actually see a correct JSON response. That's pretty much it. We'll also dive into the authorization when we look at authenticating users, but for now that's about it. As long as you can get this working in Postman and you've got your API and your client set up, you're pretty much ready to go. So we've got our client, we've got our API, but there's one last thing we just need to talk about, and that is cross-origin resource sharing support. When we get to deploy this, we don't actually need to worry about CORS because we're going to be doing some Nginx magic to keep our API on the same domain as our client. But at least for development, we do need to install some kind of CORS middleware, and I always use this one. It's really, really simple just to go ahead and install this and set the provider over in our kernel. So let's go over to the terminal and just pull this in, head back over to the GitHub page and grab the handle CORS middleware here. And let's head over to our code editor and let's open up our kernel, which is in app HTTP, and let's just add that middleware overall to our app. And that means that when we do make a request to our API, we won't get any errors over on Nuxt because we have our CORS by default allowing all origins to make requests to that API. So let's just wait for this to finish. We'll make another request to our API over on Postman just to check that we didn't break anything, and that looks good to me. So Nuxt and Laravel are set up. Let's now move over to the next part and look at setting up Tailwind manually over on our client. You've probably heard of Tailwind, but if you haven't, it's a utility-first CSS framework, and it's really easy to just start getting started styling up an app. And we're going to use this for its simplicity. Of course, later on you can choose if you are building along how you want to do this. But if you do want to learn Tailwind, then of course this is going to really help you because we're building the entire app using Tailwind. Okay, so remember earlier we had the option to include Tailwind with Nuxt. Now you will come across a couple of issues with this. I find it a lot easier to go ahead and manually install Tailwind and use Post CSS to get this working. So let's go ahead and get this set up now. So the first thing that we want to do is hop over to a new tab. We want to come over to our snippets client. So let's cd into our client, and we're going to do an npm install on Tailwind CSS, and we're going to save this to our development dependencies or our dependencies list. So let's just wait for that to finish, and then we'll look at initializing our config file. That's already finished. So we're going to use npx to run Tailwind init. What this is going to do is create a Tailwind config file, and we'll be adding to this a little bit later, so you'll see exactly what this is for. But that's just created that in the root of our project. We've got the ability to extend the theme, so if we want to change anything around, add new properties, we can. We've got a variant and a plugin section as well. We may dive into them a little bit later. Now, in terms of getting this set up with Nuxt, what we want to do is come over to our nuxt.config.js file and just come down under our build section and use Post CSS to pull this in. So let's go ahead and define the Post CSS object in here. Let's define out the plugins section just here, and let's say Tailwind CSS, and the only thing that we can do here is point to our Tailwind config file. Okay, so now that we have this pulled in here, let's head over to our assets section, and I'm going to create a new folder in here called styles, and then I'm going to create an app.css file. And inside of here, what we can do is just import the Tailwind base, the Tailwind components, and Tailwind utilities. Then what we can do is add any custom styles in here or in sub folders to this or sub files to this and require or import them in. So all of this is on the Tailwind documentation. I've just copied and pasted it over from there, and that's all you pretty much need. Now the last thing that we need to do is actually tell our Nuxt app that this is the actual CSS file that we want to work with, so we can provide this over in the CSS option just here. So let's go and point this to assets, styles, and app.css, and let's save that out, come back over to our client, give that a good refresh, and of course we've modified our Nuxt config file, so that's going to go ahead and rebuild that, and you can see that already we're seeing some style changes. So we know that Tailwind's, if we just come over to our app.css, Tailwind's base has been applied, which will effectively just perform some resets on the fonts, paddings, body, all that kind of stuff. So we can test that this works now inside of our component itself. We have this container which doesn't have any styles associated with it whatsoever, but what we can do is go ahead and say something like BG blue 500, just as an example. That's just a mid blue color, and if we just give that a refresh, sure enough we have the blue background there. We don't actually need to refresh this, so if I get rid of this and just save it, Nuxt will update itself, and you can see a little progress indicator just down there. If you have not used Nuxt before, that's just what happens. It will perform hot reloading on anything that you change inside of your component, so you don't need to keep refreshing the page. If you've worked with Nuxt before, I'm sure you know that. Okay, so we now have Tailwind manually set up inside of Nuxt, so we can just start using this, learning about it, and building out our entire UI using Tailwind. The next thing we're going to do though is look at some base styles. So we're going to just fill in some changes to our app.css file, including that container that we have in here. So we want that container to sit kind of in the middle of the page. So let's head over, add some other base styles, and we are good to start styling our app out as we need. Straight away, we're going to dive into setting up some base styles. And by this, I mean things like headers, headers that we want to use for fonts, link colors, and our main container. And we're just going to dive straight into Tailwind. We're going to start making some Tailwind customizations as well. But the first thing I want to do is just pull in a Google font, just so we have a nice font to use specifically for our headers. And I've chosen to use Rubik here, so we can go and click on this and select the font that we want to use. Okay, so we're not going to pull in too many weights here. We're going to keep this nice and clean and nice and fast. So I'm going to pull in 400 and 500 as well. So let's go over to the embed code. We're of course not just going to dump this anywhere. We're going to grab the href for this, and we're going to manually include this over in Nuxt. So if we head over to our Nuxt configuration file, of course we want this loaded globally. So under the link section in head, which uses view meta, we're going to go ahead and provide a style sheet option in here. We're going to set the href to that link that we just grabbed, and that's pretty much it. That's all we need to do. So already we will have our Rubik font ready to go. And let's just first of all set a background color to our body. Now what we could do is say background color and then set it to some gray color. So let's say just 222 for now as a dark color for this. We can close this off now as well. And of course that will work. But what we want to do is we want to make use of the default Tailwind colors. So we're actually going to use apply to pluck out that class name and apply it to this particular selector. And you can see if we head over now and just wait for that to finish, it's quite hard to see, but we have a gray color now on the background. So that is how we're going to be applying styles within any custom selectors that we create. We're not going to create many of these because most of these can just be used directly within components and we can reuse them components, but that is how we're going to be doing things. And we can do exactly the same thing with our headers as well. So I'm just going to define out each of our headers in here all the way up to H6, and I'm going to apply some fonts to our headers. So in this case, we're going to apply font header, which will basically give all of our headers the font that we have just pulled in, which is Rubik. Not just yet, we're going to need to make some adjustments to Tailwind, but we can do that now. So we're pulling in that we want each H1, H2, H3, all the way up to H6 to use the font header, which we are going to test out just now. So I'm going to go ahead and create an H1 in here, and I'm just going to write snippets. And I'm going to include just a paragraph in here saying test, just so we can differentiate between them two things. So you can see here that font header can't be found. So what we want to do is we want to extend our Tailwind configuration, and under the theme, we're going to go ahead and choose the font family extension. Basically what this will allow you to do is, as well as the standard font families that are included like sans, sans serif, all of that kind of stuff inside of Tailwind, we can also provide our own font names as well, or our font family class names as well. So in this case, the header is going to be Rubik, and that's sans serif fullback. So now that we have used font header, not font sans or font monospace or anything like that, we've used font header, that now exists. And we should see a difference between the snippets header that we've created here and the test content down here. So let's just inspect this just to make sure. And sure enough, the font family now is Rubik. And if I just inspect this paragraph, sure enough, that font is just the default that Tailwind sets in its base styles. So we've got our header sorted. Don't worry about the sizing of this. We can do this actually within the components themselves when we define the headers out, and we can even move them over to separate components if we want to, but that's pretty much that for now. So just to give you an example of that, let's just come over here and set the font weight to medium, which should be 500 by default, and let's set the text here to 2XL, or even bump it up to something like 4XL. You'll see that change. So that's basically what we're going to be doing when we style out our headers. We're going to be applying these not based on H1, H2, H3. We're just going to be styling them as we go, so we don't need to worry about applying all of them fonts inside of here. So finally, let's go and set an anchor color. So again, we can apply that we want the text here to be blue. That's just what I've chosen, so I'm going to choose 500, and let's come over and just add an anchor in here with ClickMe. Of course, we're not going to actually write text like that, so you can see that that is now blue. Perfect. And we also want to apply some styles to our paragraphs as well. So let's just add a little more text in here just so we can see this. And let's come over to our app, define out a style for our paragraph, and we're again going to apply some more Tailwind styles. So we're going to say text gray 600. We're going to set the margin bottom on each paragraph tag to 6, and we're going to set the leading to relax. That's the line height inside of here. Now your editor may shout at you and give you lots of red underlines. That's just because this isn't the kind of standard thing that you would do inside of a CSS file, so don't worry too much about that. Now, the last thing that we're going to do is set up the styles for the container. So let's go ahead and apply a width on this container of 10 out of 12, which is just basically using a standard 12 grid system. We want that 10 out of 12. And we're going to set the margin on the x-axis to auto, and that's going to go ahead and center our container. So if we head over here now and just wait for that to finish, we should see that container now centered. So we've got a nice lighter color paragraph, we've got our font header set up, and we've got our container set up so this centers it in the middle. And of course we can go ahead and test this out on a smaller screen, and of course that still looks good to me. Perfect. Okay, so a few base styles here just to get us going. We can come back to this a bit later and mess around with this, but for now that is just a nice background color added, our header font sorted out, our paragraphs sorted out, and our container to keep everything central. Okay, let's make a start on the navigation. We'll keep this really, really simple. It will be responsive. I'm going to build this out exactly as I built out when I created the site, and that is I created this for desktop first and then I did the mobile version. So we'll get this working for desktop and then we'll move on to the mobile version of this. So I've created a navigation component and I've just popped this at the top of the Nuxt area where any of our page content is rendered, and this is at the moment just a really simple div wrapper, and you can see this just over here, so it's just sitting at the top. So what we want to do is just start out with the outer styles here. This is going to have a background of white, of course, so it sits nicely. And we're going to say flex and items center, so everything sits nicely in the middle. So you can see that white background in there now. Now we want everything to kind of line up. So we're actually going to use our container class inside of here. So everything sits where our content sits on the page. And what we can also do is say flex items center with this as well. And then this will be centered on the outer container. And then of course, anything within here will be centered as well. So let's start out with the logo, and this is going to be a Nuxt link. So let's go ahead and define this Nuxt link out now. And I'm just going to go ahead and put anything in here just for now. So let's say to, well, we can actually do this, can't we? Because we already have the home page. So we're going to say to home. And let's pull this down. We will be adding classes to this, and I'm also going to go ahead and just pull this down as well. I like to do that just to keep things nice and clean. So let's start with the image. I have created a logo already and I've placed this over in assets and logo. If you want to use the same logo, feel free to go ahead and grab that either by downloading it from snippets.cocourse.com or you'll find it in the resources section of the course. And to grab this, we're just going to go into assets and we're going to pull out the SVG logo, and I'm just going to say logo for the alt text in here. Okay, so let's just take a look at this just to see where we are. Of course, at the moment that doesn't look quite great. It's a little bit too big. So in terms of the image itself, let's go ahead and add a height to this of say 8, just to reduce the height of that to something that's at least readable. And then for the outer container, what we can do is we can set the margin right to 10. So anything that we put here, e.g. the links we're going to create in a minute, will work nicely. Now, of course, at the moment, we have a kind of a padding issue here. What we're going to do is we're going to control that with the actual links itself that sit next to these. And the reason for that is I want the links themselves to have a high padding so they're clickable, easily clickable. So let's swap this out with a div, and this div is going to wrap both of our sets of links. So this is going to be a width full, and we're going to add flex to this as well. And inside of here, we're going to have left hand links and we're going to have right hand links. So we're essentially going to have links that sit here, and then this right one needs to sit over here, and that will be the kind of user authentication stuff. So for these, we can actually make these unordered lists because these are going to be where the links sit. There's no need to wrap these in an outer div. So let's swap these over to unordered lists. And then inside of here, we're going to have list items for each of our links. So let's just create a couple now. I'll create a Nuxt link here for the browse section. And I'm just going to link these all through to the home page just for now until we fix them up. And let's go ahead and just pull these down again so we can add some classes to them in a minute. And we'll do the same thing here for the next link, which will be to search. So that will be when we get to our search page. And then similarly, we'll also have links on the right hand side as well. And these will be for things like the dashboard. And I'm going to fill these all in now, and we can hide them and show them a little bit later on. And we also have the user as well. So let's just go ahead and add in my name in there, or your name if you're following along. And we'll also have a sign in link. We'll also have a create an account link. And we'll also have a sign out link. That might be a little bit too much to demonstrate what I am showing, but we'll leave it at that for now. So these don't look great at the moment. So we'll focus on these two first of all, and then we'll copy the styles over to the other ones. Okay, so for the unordered list itself, this is where we want to give the height. So this unordered list here will control the height of the entire nav bar. I tend to use this method just so everything sits nicely. I tend to find it a little bit easier. And we're going to say flex item center, and that's going to pull everything up to sit next to each other. And we can do exactly the same thing on this one, and that should pull everything next to each other like so. Great. So we should have enough room to demonstrate this. Okay, so for the list items, we don't want to style these, but what we want to do for the actual links themselves is start to style these up. So we're going to say text gray 700, and now we want to add some padding on the X and Y axis to kind of make these a little bit bigger. And you can see that's adjusted the height of the navbar. So we have a great big clickable area here, which is really useful for when we are, of course, trying to go over and click on them. So let's copy these styles here over to each of our links that we have. So I have dashboard. We might get rid of a few of these just so we can demonstrate pulling them over to the right, but that should be okay. And that looks okay to me. Okay, we should be good. So let's now focus on how we're going to get these from dashboard over to sign out, pushed over to the right hand side. That's pretty straightforward. All we really need to do is say margin left auto with flex box, and what that will do is push everything over to the right hand side. But what I'm also going to do is add a text right, just so everything shifts over a little bit depending on how much spacing we have. Okay, let's just take a look at what happens when we resize the browser window. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the device toolbar here. Just pull my console down a little bit because we don't really need that. You can see that first of all, we don't have any wrapping here. Second of all, the logo seems to shrink and it really just creates a little bit of a mess. So what we want to do is on the overall container, we want some kind of flex wrapping. So on this container here, which houses all of these links, so this and this as well, we want to wrap these on a smaller viewport. So I'm going to go ahead and add a flex wrap. Let's just do that next to the flex here. So flex wrap. And then on a large viewport, we want to say flex no wrap because we don't want that wrapping on a large viewport. So let's pull this in and you can see that already this is looking a little bit better. The logo's not shrinking. The logo is getting a little bit larger and we'll see why that is in a minute. But that should do just for now. So at least we're wrapping the logo down so we can have our links here sit underneath them. Now, I think to get around the issue of the logo kind of changing in size, what we can actually do is over on the Nuxt link here, set a flex shrink to 0. Now what that should do is increase the original size of the logo in the large viewport, and then it won't change size when we go smaller. The reason this is happening is because all of this content here is pushing that element in terms of its flexibility using Flexbox, and it's making this image smaller. So we're saying do not shrink this logo so it remains the same on desktop and mobile, etc. Okay, so for the rest of the responsiveness, what we kind of want is down here a link which will open the nav. We'll be styling this up a little bit better in the next part, but for now we are going to add a click event onto here, or a click handler, to go ahead and set some kind of mobile nav open property to true. So let's say mobile nav open equals not mobile nav open, and that's just a really quick tip to toggle something. So down in our script section, let's go ahead and bring in some data here, and let's return an object and say mobile nav open, and of course by default we're going to set this to false. What we can now do is, if the mobile nav is open, we can toggle around what we want to show. Now the first thing that we want to do is just pull this down, because we're going to bind in some classes. When we go onto a smaller viewport, we want to hide the links. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some classes if the mobile nav is not open, e.g. We are on a small viewport but we are not opening the nav, and that is that we want to make this hidden. And then what we want to do is say large flex. So what that will achieve is, we're on a large viewport, of course we still see this, but we can get rid of that in a minute. When we come down to a smaller viewport, that disappears, but of course what we can then do is click on this to toggle the mobile nav open, like so. So that's a really, really simple way of doing that. Okay, so let's focus now on the links when this is open. So of course we don't want them all bunched up like this. So what we're going to do is modify our items itself. So we're only going to make the height of the links 24 when we're on a large viewport, and we're going to do the same for flex as well. And what we can also do is set this to by default be a width of full, but on large set this to be a width of auto. And if we do that for this as well, so if we say large only height 24, on large viewport only flex, and do exactly the same as this, so we can just copy that over here, then we end up with the following. So this isn't great. You probably want to style this up a little bit better yourself, but I basically want all of the left hand links on this side and all of the right hand links on this side, but I just want them underneath each other. You can probably build a better nav, but this is just how I did it. So what we now want to do is remove some of this padding when we are on a small viewport. So I'm going to switch over each of these to only have padding on the Y and the X axis when we're on a large viewport. And what we'll do is we'll see that nicely come in together. So let's just switch all of these ones over and make sure we get all of them. So these ones up here as well. And we end up with the following. So that's kind of set that in the right place. And of course, when we go large, that looks a lot better. Okay, so the next thing to do then is add a little bit of padding on this. So just up here, what I'm going to say is I want there to be a padding on the y-axis of 8, but then when we're on a large viewport, we want to get rid of that because we're already handling that with the height of the links. So that should now look okay. Perfect. So that looks good to me. And now we can just hide this open button on the large viewport. So let's come down to where our link is here and add some classes in. We will say on large, we want this to be hidden, pretty straightforward. And what we can also do is set a margin left to auto on this, and we can fiddle around with the rest of the styles in the next part. So now when I go and make this smaller, we get our open button, we can toggle out nav, and that looks good to me. Perfect. Now, one last thing, if we open this, you can see there's a little bit of a spacing issue between this stuff and the links. So we can go ahead and fix that up now. And to do that, what we could do is bind in another class here, and we could say we want a margin top of 8 when the mobile nav is open, like so. So that will give it a little bit of spacing when that's open, and that looks good to me. Great. Okay, so we've got a really, really basic responsive nav here. I'm sure you can do a lot better if you are into design, but what we're going to do in the next part is style out this hamburger menu. That's going to involve pulling in a Tailwind plugin. So let's go over and examine that in the next part. So let's replace this open text with 3 spans. There are multiple different ways you can do this with before and afters, but I'm just going to keep things really, really simple here. And these spans are going to represent the 3 bars on the hamburger menu. Now we need to space these out nicely. Let's style them up first. So let's get rid of the other two just here. And let's add some classes onto each of these spans. So I'm going to set a background on these of blue. I'm going to give them a height of 1, a width of 8, and I'll make these rounded just to round the corners out. And I'm going to give the margin bottom of 1. So if we shoot over, we can't actually see this at the moment. So on the base of here, let's go ahead and add a flex display. Let's add flex col, so these sit underneath each other. And let's add a relative position to this so we can style this up. And I'm also going to add a width and a height to this as well, like so. So we should now see the following. Great. Now this isn't sat quite right at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and add a justify center to this. And we should see the following. Great. So that will do just for now for our hamburger menu. And we can click on this and of course see our items. Now what we want to do is shift this around to a X symbol when we open this up. And to do that, we're going to need to use transforms. So what we'll need to do is pull over the Tailwind CSS Transforms plugin. Let's go and install this and I'll show you how to use it. So let's come over to our terminal. Let's go ahead and install this. Just wait for this to finish and then we'll pull the plugin in. Okay, so that's pulled in. Let's go over to our Tailwind config. Under our plugins section, we're going to go ahead and require this in. So we're going to require in Tailwind CSS Transforms, and you can pass properties to this if you want to, so or options to this if you want to within this object. So I'll just leave that there for you if you need to. Okay, so that's pretty much it for now. We can go ahead and implement this ourselves. What we want to do is over in our theme section, we want to add in how we want to configure our rotation. And we want to rotate the spans that we've created by 45 degrees and minus 45 degrees to achieve the effect that we want. So let's give in the rotate property here and let's say 45. So when we use rotate 45, that will rotate that by 45 degrees. So we just want to include the CSS value for that. And we also want a minus 45 degrees as well. And I'm just going to switch that up to 45. Great. So there's our two rotations specified using our Tailwind CSS Transforms plugin. And what we can now do is figure out how to do this. So what I'm just going to do first of all, because we need to bind some classes in, I'm going to get rid of them too and pull this down. And I'm going to add in the class bindings just here, and then we can duplicate them over in just a minute. So for the first one, what we want to do is when we have a mobile nav open, we want to rotate this by 45 degrees. We want to set the position to absolute and we want to set the right to 0. And then for the second one, we want to rotate that by minus 45 degrees. And the way we do this is not rotate minus minus. What Tailwind will do is it will allow you to use minus before that if you have specified a minus value in here. So it's quite clever in making these quite easy to read. So again, we'll have this on the right hand side. And then for the third one, we want to get rid of that because we only want the X symbol in there. So all I'm going to do is set that to hidden when the mobile nav is open. So what we should now be able to do is click on this and see that X. We're not looking at animations or anything, and there are plenty of open source examples of hamburger menus and animating them nicely. But for now, this will just about do. We have this turning into an X, which I think is pretty self-explanatory for people that are working on a mobile. So there we go. We have styled out our hamburger menu. We've got our navigation, which is responsive. We can click to open up, and of course we can click through onto any of these pages. The only thing that I noticed just off screen is that we've linked these all through to home, which isn't correct. I know it doesn't matter for now because we're not actually going anywhere with these, but these need to link to index just because of the way that Nuxt links through to things. And we should also do the same thing for the home as well. So we can click on that now, or click on any of these in fact, and go back to the home page. The goal of this part is to get authentication working in the sense that we can log in with a username and password and receive back a token. We'll implement that on the client side a little bit later. Now I've brought up Postman. If you're not already using Postman, go ahead and grab it. It's just a basic REST client. And you can see here that I'm making a GET request to the Snippets API test domain that I have set up in Homestead. API. And of course, we don't have any routes defined here just now. Now, the other thing that we want to do is focus on our database. I've created a snippets database. I'm using Postgres, but of course MySQL is going to work in exactly the same way. So feel free to go ahead and set that up. And we want to go ahead and add in our database configuration to Laravel so we can actually run our migrations. So the database here is just called snippets, and the username is Homestead for me, and the password is secret. So what I can actually do now, head over to the terminal. I can run PHP Artisan migrate. We'll just use our default migrations, and that will create the users table. So if we jump back over to the database, let's just have a look at that. So we've got our users table in here. And what I now want to do is just create a fake user. So I'm going to come over and run PHP Artisan Tinker. And we're going to go ahead and using our factory helper and using app user, we're going to create a user in here. And we're going to give an email address in here. So that will just be my email address. And we'll give a name as well. And we'll give a password in here. So let's use the bcrypt helper to generate a password, and I'm just going to call that password. So that's my user created. I can exit out of Tinker now, and now we can actually use this to authenticate. So that's over in the database here, and we can move on to authenticating and sending a request. So the endpoint is going to be something like API/auth and then sign in. And we're going to be sending across a body in here as well. So we're going to have an email address, which will be, of course, the email address I just registered with. And we will also send the password, which in my case will just be password. So again, if I send this request across, it doesn't work just at the moment. So we're going to be using JWT auth for this. So we're going to be returning a JSON web token, and Nuxt auth, when we get to that later, we'll be able to handle this really nicely and sign us in. So what we're going to do is head over to the releases section just to make sure we're grabbing the right release. I'm going to install the version 1 release candidate 5 because it comes with Laravel 6 compatibility. If you're watching this tutorial a little bit into the future, this will probably be released. So just double check the releases section before you install it. So I'm going to head over to jwtauth.com. That will give us the documentation here, and we can come into the Laravel installation section and we can require this in with that version. So if we come over to our terminal, let's do a composer require. I'm going to paste that release candidate version in, grab the name of the package, and I'm going to pop this all in quotes like so. So we pull in the right version. If you do use Laravel 6 and don't pull this version in, you'll find that it doesn't have everything that you need. Okay, so that's pulled in. Let's go ahead and grab the command to publish the configuration. We do need that because if we just head over to our code, we want to go over to config and JWT. What I'm going to do is just temporarily, I'm going to set the time to live for the token to a much higher value than 60 minutes. So I'm actually going to pop over to my env file and I'm going to paste this in, and I'm going to set this to something just really high. That will basically mean just while we're testing this on our local environment, the token won't expire after 60 minutes and we won't be signed out. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do is generate our secret key, which is really important for generating tokens that are as secure as possible. So let's head back over to our terminal, paste that in, and what that will do is add that to your env file automatically. So we've got our JWT secret just inside of there. Great. Okay, so what we can now do is just start to follow the steps to create out a controller. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of the controllers in here because I don't need any of these for API authentication. And we can go ahead and head over to our API routes to start building these out. So let's come over here and let's start by creating a root group in here. And the prefix I'm going to give this is auth, just so any of the routes that we define under here will come under the auth prefix in the URI. And we can also set a namespace to this as well. So let's go ahead and set a namespace to auth. What that will do is any controllers that we create inside of an auth folder won't need the prefix when we define out each individual route. Okay, so let's go and generate a controller. Let's just come over to our terminal and run PHP Artisan make controller, and let's create auth. We can call this sign in controller, login controller, whatever you like. Great. Okay, so let's come back over. Let's open this up and just create out an invoke method. We don't need a method name for this. And let's just die dump and say works, just so at least we know that this is working. So we've got a sign-in controller in the auth namespace. All we need to do now is define out a post route through to sign in, and we need to reference the sign-in controller. That's all we need to do for this, and we've got an invoke method inside of here, so we don't need to say something like @index or @run, whatever you would normally do. Okay, so heading over to Postman, if we send this post request across now, sure enough, we get that dumped value out in there. Great. So we can actually fill in the sign-in process now, which is relatively straightforward. First thing we want to do is validate this. We can use a form request for this, but I'm just going to do this inline here. And we want to pull in our request object so we can actually read from the request. So we're going to pass our request object into there. And for the email and the password, this is pretty straightforward. This is just going to be required, and it needs to be an email format. And for the password, that is just going to be required. Great. So we can now test our validation over here. Let's send this request across. And as long as we have the right headers, we should get back the right information, but that doesn't look right. Oh yeah, of course, because we have these in here, don't we? Let's just get rid of them. There we go. So we've got our validation back in JSON format. Okay, so now we can start the authentication process. So let's say if not token, so we're checking and assigning a value at the same time to token, but also checking if it's a false or a null value. We're going to use auth to attempt using from our request only the email and the password. So that will give us an array back with the email and the password. And if this fails, for now we'll just die dump and say fail. And otherwise we'll go ahead and return response. And let's make this, of course, a JSON response. And then data, we'll just compact down the token in there. Great. Now this isn't actually going to work at the moment. If we just send a request across here with our email address and our password, what you'll see is you get token true, which is really odd. What we actually need to do is over in our auth config, we need to just set up the default guard. So the default guard is going to be the API because this application only runs as an API. And for the API driver, we're not going to use a token based, we're going to use JWT. So the package that we pulled in will handle everything else for us. Let's go ahead and send this request across, and we've got JWT subject needs to be implemented on user. So that's one more thing that we need to do to get this working. If we come over to our user class here, what we need to do is implement JWT subject on this. Let's pull the class in for this, and let's actually open that to see what kind of methods that we need. So we need get JWT identifier, and we need get JWT custom claims. So for these, this is really simple. For the identifier, all we need to do is return the user's ID. So we're going to say this, I think it's get ID. We'll double check in a minute. And for the custom claims, we don't need any at the moment, so we can just return an empty array. So let's just check this out in Postman. And get ID, yeah, that's not defined. So I think it might be get key. Let's just have a look here. There we go, perfect. Okay, so what this is returned to us now is a JWT token or JSON web token, which allows us to, for any other request here, send this token across and authenticate. All this will be handled seamlessly inside of Nuxt, so we don't need to worry too much about this for now. What we're going to do before that is just figure out what happens when we log in unsuccessfully, because at the moment we're just dumping something, which of course isn't great. So over in the sign-in controller, when this fails, what we actually want to do is kind of simulate a validation error so we can show that on the client side. So what I tend to do is just copy the response that we would normally get when we have validation errors. It's not technically a validation error, but we can use that to our advantage on the front end. So basically what I'm just saying is I'm wrapping inside of this errors what I want to show this message in. And for the first error, we're going to say something like could not sign you in with those details. And we'll see this in action a little bit later if this doesn't make too much sense. So what we'll now see is when we send this across, we get the errors email could not sign you in. Now the last thing we want to do with this is just add a 422, so that's a validation response. Of course you can send a 401 or something like that to say that it's unauthorized. It's entirely up to you. So that is pretty much it. If we don't include something in here, we get errors. If we log in incorrectly, we get errors in the same format as validation, so we can use them in the same way as validation. And when we do sign in successfully, we get back a token in here, which we can use to authenticate the user. Brilliant. We can successfully authenticate and grab a token back, but let's test this by duplicating over a tab and making a GET request to something like auth/me. What this will do is, as long as we include that bearer token in our request, we should get back information about the currently authenticated user. So I'm going to copy this token over and I'm going to pop that inside of there, and I'm going to send a request through to this endpoint. Of course, it doesn't exist just at the moment. So we can go ahead and create this controller. Let's go over to our terminal and do that now. So let's write PHP Artisan make controller, and let's put this inside of auth, and we'll call this me controller. Similar thing here. What we want to do is just create an invoke method, and let's just do nothing in there for now. Let's bring our request in that allows us to grab the currently authenticated user. And in fact, let's just die dump on request user, just so we can see that user's information. So if we head over to our API routes here, we can create a new route to get me, and of course reference the me controller. So nice and tidy. All right, so let's send a request through to this, and sure enough, we get information back about the currently authenticated user. But we need to present this in a nice way, and we're going to use Fractal to do this. We won't be installing Fractal directly. What we'll do is we'll use the Laravel Fractal package, which allows us to create transformers so we can nicely display information wrapped and decorated in a different class. And if this is all very new to you, don't worry, we'll be covering exactly what this does and how it works. Okay, so let's go and install this package. So let's find the composer command for this, and let's pull this in for Laravel 5.5 and up. Let's come over to our terminal, pop that in, and just wait for that to finish. In the meantime, you can publish the configuration if you want. That's more for advanced usage if you want to change around the serializer or the paginator. We don't really need to do that just yet. So what we can now do is start to create out our user transformer. So we basically want to take all of that information and transform it in a nice, easy way. Now over in our terminal, now that's finished, if we run PHP Artisan, it should have a make transformer. There it is. So we're going to make a transformer in here. Let's say PHP Artisan make transformer, and let's put this, let's think about the directory structure here. Let's just put this in a users directory. So let's say users user transformer. There we go. Great. So if we come back over to our code, what we should now have is a transformers directory with that in there, and we can start to return some information about the current user. Let's go and figure out how we use this in here first, and then I'll show you how we pull that information in here. So let's just leave this empty for now. So inside of the me controller, what we basically want to do is, using the Fractal helper function, we want to choose an item. This is can either be an item or a collection of items. We'll see more of that later. And we're going to go ahead and grab the user. So that's the thing that we want to transform. And we want to transform this with, and of course we want to new up the user transformer class that we've created. So let's make sure that we import that at the top. And then we want to say to array. So Laravel can grab that and cast it to a JSON response. Okay, so let's go over to Postman and just check this out. So let's send this request across, and it looks like we get an empty set of data. And as you would have imagined, that is because we haven't filled in anything here. Now, what's going to happen here is, because we have this item chosen, this will be passed through to our user transformer. So we can accept that user into here and then read any properties from that user class. So let's again make sure we pull the namespace in for this. So let's go ahead and output the user's ID. This is going to be the private user transformer. We'll be creating a public user transformer a little bit later for showing information about other users. It's really important that you don't show things like the user's email address and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty sensitive. So let's go ahead and output the user's name, and we can also, I think that will do just for now. Great. So let's go back over here, send this request across, and sure enough, we get that information back about the user. So now we can successfully authenticate the user, they can get back a token and they can see information about themselves. And again, all of these endpoints will be handled really nicely with Nuxt Auth a little bit later. And we can also create other endpoints as well. And as long as the user has passed in a token, they will be authenticated. Now, just before we forget, if we don't pass a token in here, so let's just say inherit auth from parent, you'll see that we get an error. We don't necessarily want that because what's trying to happen is we're trying to pass a null value through to transform. So let's go over to the me controller and I'm just going to add a doc block to that. Let's create out a constructor in here. And let's use the middleware method on the parent controller to say that we can only access this if we are authenticated using the API provider. We don't need to include that because it's our default provider, but I always do just anyway. So let's go ahead and send this request across again. And sure enough, we get an unauthenticated message back with the correct status code. Brilliant. Before we start to look at sending requests through our API, we really need a nice way to configure our base URL for our API. And we're going to do that using environment variables. And this is for a very good reason. When we deploy this later on production, we will want a different base URL for our API. It's not going to be our local URL. So we're not going to hard code this anywhere. We're going to keep this nice and separate, and we're not going to push this up to version control. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside of client, create a .env file. This will be where we store any of our environment variables. Very, very similar to the way this works in Laravel. And what we can now do is set our API URL in here, and we can set other configuration inside of here as well. Now, if we just come over to our Postman instance here, this is going to be our base URL for our local testing or local development. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this in here. And what we can now do is install the .env npm package or package from npm. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this installation command. I'm going to come over to our client here and I'm going to install this. And what this will allow us to do is read any environment files from this env file. So let's go ahead and require in .env and then let's use the config method to grab any of the values from this. Now what I'm just going to do is, for now, just to test this, I'm going to console log out env.parsed, and that's going to give me a parsed list of anything inside of env, and that will mean that we can now start to use them values. So if we head over to the terminal over here, what we should be able to do is close this off. In fact, I actually just saw that, but let's rerun it again just for the sake of it. And you can see we've got API URL in here with that value that we provided. So we now know that's working and we've got environment variables set up. We can read these within our components if we want to. But the main thing is that we can configure, say, Axios to have that base URL a little bit later. All right, so let's get the Nuxt Auth module installed so we can actually start to send a request through to our API to sign the user in. This is incredibly straightforward to get set up. We're going to go ahead and follow the instructions just over here. So let's go ahead and do an npm install on Nuxt.js auth. We don't need to install Axios because as part of the process earlier, if we just head over to our Nuxt configuration, we already chose to install Axios, so we don't need to install that. So let's come over here and just pop that in, and let's go back over here and look at what else we need to do. So we need to go ahead and pull this in alongside Axios under our module section. So let's do that now. And just while that's all installing, for Axios, we may as well set the base URL in here now. We already know how to do that because we looked at setting up our environment variables in the last part. So we're going to say env.parsed and we're going to access API URL. What that will do is Nuxt Auth will now read from this value when it's constructing its URLs, and we won't run into any trouble. Now, while we're doing that, we can also create out our auth config inside of here, and we can define things called strategies, and then as part of them strategies, we can define the endpoints. So let's just make sure that everything has been installed first of all, and that looks good to me. What we can now do is start to set this up. So for auth, we're going to define out our strategies in here, and we're going to have a local strategy. That's of course just sending a request through to our API, getting back a simple token and allowing the user to see their information about themselves and also log out. So to log in, let's provide the details for this. The URL for this is, and remember we've defined our base URL, so we don't need to define the full path to this, auth sign in. Now really importantly, we need to provide the method, which is post, so we know how to get through to that. And even more importantly will be the property name for the token that's returned to authenticate the user. And this is just a dot notation, and we know it's data.token. If we head over to Postman, we know that when we successfully sign in, we get data and token. So we can provide that in there so it knows how to read the token back from the response. Now, similarly, we have a user part of this as well, which we know is auth/me. We know that the method for this is get, and we know that the property for this is just data. So anything inside of data will relate to a user. Now we can also define logout in here, but we've not quite got to that yet. So let's just come back over to our client and see what's going on. You can see we get a site cannot be reached. This is a really common problem with the auth module. Essentially what's happened is we've seen a fatal error because we need to enable the Vuex store within Nuxt. So if we come over to the store directory here, all we need to do is create an index.js file. We don't need to create anything in here. That will just allow the store to be created. So let's go and rerun npm run dev, wait for that to boot up, and we will basically have authentication set up and ready to go, and we can actually start to sign the user in. So let's head over and give that a refresh, and we're going to go ahead and create a sign in page now to test this out. Okay, so let's go into our pages section. Let's create an auth section here, and let's create a signin.view component in here. Define our template out, and this will just be to sign in. We're not actually going to style this out just yet, but we'll style that out in a couple of bars time. All right, so let's create our script out in here just so we've got that handy and ready to go. And what we're going to do is over in the navigation, set this up to link through to auth sign in. Great. So we can now click on this and head over to the sign in page. Great. So in sign in, let's just add a class of container in here. And while we're here, we might as well say margin top 16, which we're going to do with all of our pages just to bring that down a little bit. Great. Okay, so for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a sign in link, and I'm going to manually pass the credentials through before we start to build out our form and looking at validation. So I'm going to go ahead and say click.prevent submit, and I'm going to define out that submit method in here, which will go ahead and actually sign the user in. And this is incredibly easy to use with Nuxt auth. So all we really want to do is say this, and we can actually make this asynchronous for it to wait. So let's say await this auth, which has now been installed, log in with, and we can choose the strategy which we defined, which is local. And then we can pass the data that we want to send through to our API, which we know is the email address. And I'm just going to hard code this in for now. And it's the password as well, of course. So let's just hard code all of that information in. Now, if you don't already have Vue DevTools installed, I'd recommend going ahead and grabbing these. Let's just bring this back and pull this up a little bit. What you'll find this allows you to do is monitor your Vuex store. So you can see just here, if we just load our state, we've got an auth state that has been created using the Nuxt auth module. This tells us if we're logged in, which of course we're not at the moment. It tells us the default strategy and the user properties as well. Now what's going to happen is as soon as I hit sign in here, we get a request failed with a status code 404. So let's check this out first of all. It looks like it's going through to API/API/auth/login. So obviously something has gone horribly wrong here. Let's head over to Nuxt config and just check this out. So auth sign in. So that doesn't look like it's worked. Okay. So what we didn't do is wrap this in an endpoints object. So let's do that now. Great. So if we come over to our page again and give that a refresh, keeping an eye on our Vuex store, what we should see is that update. So if we load our state in, we can see that we are logged in now, and the user has all of that user's information in. And the question is now, how do we actually make this look like we're signed in? Of course, we've hard coded all this information in, because we're technically signed in, and we're signed in even when we refresh. So if I load the state in, you can see that we're still logged in. We can just go ahead and fiddle around with things like our navigation. So for example, let's just create out a template up here, and let's create another template here and say, well, we want to show this contents if we are signed in. So I'm just going to say if auth.loggedin, which is reading from that value in the state. Well, if we're logged in, we want to see our dashboard, we want to see our name, and we probably want to see a sign out link as well. So let's also pop that just inside of there. And then we can do a v-else on this template and then put anything we want to show if we're not authenticated, which of course is the ability to click login and click create an account. So what we should now see is I am signed in. Now we're not actually showing the name that has been returned from this endpoint, but that's really, really easy. We can just say auth.user.name. So any of the properties that we have in there will now be shown up there. And that doesn't change because I hard coded my same name in, but you get the idea. If I just change this over to say email, you'll see that change up there. Great. So we'll leave that at the name, of course, because that makes sense. But that is signing ourselves in. Everything has been logged to our store. Everything has been placed inside of either local storage or cookies on our client, and we're signed in even when we refresh. Signing out is going to involve a change to our API and our client, because of course we need to create an endpoint to invalidate the current user's token, which is really, really important. So let's start by just creating a new controller out to handle that. So let's go ahead and create a sign out controller, and let's head over to that sign out controller and start to configure this. So sign out controller. This is pretty straightforward. Again, we're just going to use an invoke method in here because we don't really need to do too much. And in fact, we don't need to even pull the user in. We can just say auth log out. That's really all we need to do inside of here. The only other thing that you might want to do is create a constructor in here to only allow this page or this endpoint to be hit if you're signed in, because it doesn't make sense to try and invalidate a token that doesn't exist. So let's also do that. Great. So let's head over to our routes and API, and let's duplicate this down and send a post request to sign out, and of course reference the sign out controller. Great. So we can test this now over in Postman. Let's sign in. Let's grab this token. Let's use this token over here to grab information about myself, and let's duplicate this over and make a request to sign ourselves out. We still need the bearer token in there to sign out. Remember, we don't need anything in the body, but that doesn't matter too much for now. Let's hit this. We get 200 OK. And when I try and use that token now, you can see it has been blacklisted or invalidated. So that is really, really simple on the back end, how to sign us out. Now what we can do is focus on the client. So remember earlier when we configured our strategies and our endpoints for this, what we can now do is configure a strategy or an endpoint to log the user out. So for this, it's going to be /sign out. The method for this is going to be post, and we don't need any property name. That doesn't make sense. So what we can do now is go over to the navigation, and we can add a hook onto this sign out link. Now this doesn't actually need to be a Nuxt link, so we can turn this back into a standard anchor and add in a empty href and add a click prevent onto this to sign the user out. So we can just say sign out, doesn't really matter too much what we do. And let's add that method into this sign out component. Let's just log something out here for now, just so we know that this is all hooked up, and then we'll implement actually signing out. So I'm signed in at the moment. When I click that, we successfully call that method. Okay, now to sign the user out, this is really, really straightforward. All we do is we make this asynchronous, and we go ahead and wait for this auth, and you guessed it, log out. That's all we need to do. And of course the store, the Vuex store, will be updated accordingly So our name will go and that template will now shift around to show us the options to sign in. So we can sign in now and we can sign out. Okay, let's focus on the sign in design now and actually hook up the inputs so we can actually type in our information rather than rely on this hard-coded link just here. So this is going to take a little bit of a while, but all of the components that we create here, or all of the elements that we style, will just be able to be copied and pasted elsewhere. We're not going to put these into individual components just yet. That will be a kind of refactoring stage for a little bit later. So what I'm going to do is get rid of this link first of all just here. I'm going to keep this container and margin top because that's really important. And inside of here, I'm going to create another div wrapper. We could add the styles to the base, but we'll just go ahead and create a new one. And we're going to create a flex with a flex column, and we're going to say items center. And the reason for that is we're going to have an H1 in here, which will be the title to sign in, which I'm just going to set to hello. And then here we can say something like text 3XL, text gray 700 maybe, and let's set the font to medium for this. And let's set a margin bottom of 10 on this as well. So that will give us something like the following. Perfect. And then just underneath here, we can have our form with our white background. So down here then, let's create out our form and let's create the action to a hash because we don't actually need that at the moment. And let's go ahead and set the class into here. So we're going to say background white and padding 8 and rounded. And let's just check this out for now. We'll just need to put some information in there just very quickly. Great. Next we will go ahead and set the width on this to full and the margin bottom to 6. Now that's set the container to a full width, but what we can do is change this around for different viewports. So we'll actually start now at our kind of mobile version, and then as we come out we can make this a little bit smaller. So to do that, we're going to say, well, on a medium viewport I want this to be a width of 6 out of 12, and then on a large we're going to make that a little bit smaller and we're going to say 4 out of 12. We won't make this exact, but what that will allow us to do is have this relatively nicely sized based on the different viewports. Okay, so now that we've got the actual container done, we can look at starting to create our form groups. I always create a div with a class in here and a margin bottom of say 6. This will be an input, and then we'll have an input down here as well, so for the username and the password, and this will also contain the label. And these grouping elements here just mean we can space things out nicely. So let's just start with our label for our email address. So we're going to say email, and we'll say that's for email. And why don't we style up the input as well? I'm going to set this to an input type of text just because we want to test out the validation for this. But you can change that over to a type of email if you want in-browser validation as well. So let's just fill these out. So not looking great at the moment. We can't even see this, and we can actually get rid of this because I've already demonstrated why we're doing that. Let's start to style in our input first of all. So let's bring these properties down. I always do this just to keep things nice and tidy so we don't end up with huge long lines of each. And let's just add some classes to our input. So I'm going to add a border on this of 2, and then I'm going to color the border gray at 400. I'm going to set this to rounded, and I'm going to set this to a block element so it's full width, and I'm also going to provide a width full as well. And I'm going to set a padding of 3 on here as well. So already just with Tailwind, that creates quite a nice section for us to start typing in. Okay, so let's go and style out the label as well now. So again, I'm going to pull the attributes of this down, and let's also set this to a block, and we'll say text gray 600. We'll set the font to medium so it's nice and clear, and we'll set the margin bottom to 2, so that nicely styles that out as well. Of course you can play around with these, it's entirely up to you. With Tailwind at least you can, you know, just create your own styles however you want. Okay, so we've got our input, we've got our label for our email address and our password, or our email address. Let's go ahead and do the same for the password as well. Now for this we are going to change the type to password, and we're also going to change the name over for each of them, and of course the password in there as well. Great. So we've got our email address and our password that we can enter. Let's just get rid of our console for now, just so we can see this a little bit better. Okay, so we're going to create another group down here. This is going to be for our submit button. So we're going to have a button with a type of submit in here, and we're just going to say sign in. Of course, by default, that's not going to look very good. And let's go ahead and add in some classes to this. So for this, we'll set the background to blue, I think. Set the text to white, of course, so it stands out on there. And we'll set the padding to 4 and we'll make it rounded as we have with most other elements. Let's just check that out. That looks okay to me. We'll also set the text to center, and we'll set the font to medium as well, just to give it a little bit of boldness. And for this one, I'm going to set the type to block and width full, so that spans the entire width of that. And in actual fact, with this container here, we could probably get away with just not including that class, just so we don't include that extra spacing at the bottom. Now, just underneath the form, I want to include a div in here and say something like no account, and then I want a Nux link in here to go through to the sign in page. So I'm going to say create one here, and let's again just pull this down and say to, and let's say name index, because of course we don't have the create account page just yet. And let's just see how that sits on the page. First of all, that looks okay to me. And for this outer wrapper, let's go ahead and just say text center, and let's make the text a little bit grayer. Okay, so this page is looking good. Let's just think about our validation states just for now. So if something does go wrong in terms of validation, I want some kind of message just inside of here. And let's style this up very quickly. So let's set the text to red, and we'll set that to 500. Set a margin bottom of 4. We'll make the text small, and we'll set a margin on the top as well. So we have something like the following. And what we will do is, if we do have an error, what we'll do is we'll change the border color. So let's just override this to red 500. So we should see something like the following. And you could even do the same thing for the label as well if you wanted to. So of course, that's just as easy as setting the text to a red 500 like so. So that's what we'll end up with if we have a validation error. But of course, what we need to do is bind them in when we do actually see a validation error. So let's just bring that margin top back on there, and let's just comment this out for now. Great. Okay, so let's just hook this up so we can actually click to sign in. We've already got our submit method in here. So let's, again, just pull these properties down on multiple lines just to keep things nice and tidy so we can see what we're doing. And let's say submit prevent and submit. Now we need a model on our email. So we're going to say form.email, and we're going to do the same for the password, form.password. And all that means is that when we type in there, this will be synced up to any data we have in our component. So I always wrap the data that I create in a form inside of a form property. It just makes it a little bit easier to send this across to our API when we're ready. So let's enter our email password in here. And at the top, if you are new to Vue, you should be able to now say form. And then when we type something in here, we should see that data. Great. And we can send that across to the method that we've already looked at in terms of signing in. So really all we need to do now is say this.form, and that will send that data across to our API. And we'll fix this up to redirect us in just a moment. What we should now be able to do is go and enter my email address and my password, either hit enter or click sign in, and of course be signed in. And that looks like it's working to me. Let's just check the responsiveness of this just one more time, just to make sure everything looks good. And I think that will just about do. Great, so that looks okay to me. Brilliant. We're going to go over the basics of event handling, which we've already looked at throughout this series, but we're going to go on to some more practical examples, as well as some useful modifiers that you can use when you're working with events. So by events, I mean, as we've already seen with things like buttons, we can use Xdata directly on the button, or if this button was within a component, then this would still work in exactly the same way. We can use X on, and then we can say click. That's the name of the actual event itself. And then we want to do something in that instance. So let's go ahead and just console log out clicked. So we've already seen this work before. Let's just say click me. Let's head over to the browser and let's check this out. There we go. So that works. Now, one thing that you can do that I don't actually like doing is you can use the shorthand at to click. And if you come from Vue.js, you'll know that this is pretty much the same as well. So I can use an at click and that's going to have exactly the same effect. Let's just try this out and you can see it works in the same way. I don't like doing this. I prefer using X on. It just feels more natural to me. But you have that at symbol there if you do want to bind some kind of event in instead of writing out X on and then the colon. So these event handlers can be attached to pretty much anything. So for example, if we had a outer div and we had a div inside of this, like I said before, as long as you have a component, this event can be attached to any element inside of that component. So let's just say that we had a div that said click me. Well, we can attach an event handler to that. It works in exactly the same as JavaScript would. We would use something like document get element by ID. We would find that element by its ID, could be anything, and then we would add an event listener. So that's pretty much what's going on behind the scenes. Let's go ahead and say X on click and we'll console log clicked a div and let's go over. And there we go. So it works in exactly the same way. So you can attach these events to pretty much any HTML element. Let's dive right in with a more practical example. And this is going to be a text input that lets you hold shift to go down to a new line rather than submit it. I've just gone ahead and pulled the code in for what we're going to be building just so you can see exactly what this is going to do. I'm going to type some text in here and hit enter, and you can see that by pressing enter, that's actually submitting it. These kind of inputs, these text areas, are useful for when you have some kind of chat application where you want to actually submit the text and then clear it out afterwards. However, with this, if we just give this page a refresh, if I type ABC and I hold shift, I can actually go down and navigate these lines and write more before I then further hit enter to submit this through. So this is just really a classic example of what you might build when you're learning about events. So let's build this out from scratch. The first thing that we're going to have is a form. When we hit enter on that, it's going to submit this form for us. So we'll make the form itself the component with X data. We're not going to store anything in X data, but we are going to say X on submit, and then that's going to go ahead and console log out what we saw before. So we'll just say submitted, and that would of course go ahead and probably send a request across. And the actual method for sending that data perhaps to an API or some kind of service would be within X data, so that method would be defined in there. Now inside of here, we're of course going to have our text area. Let's get rid of the name and ID because we're not really worried about hooking this up properly. And let's just go over and preview this, and there we go. We have exactly what we saw before. Just at the moment, we have absolutely no functionality. So let's go and just pull this down and pull the rows down. Typically when we write this out, we've kind of seen this, we would pull these down to new lines just so it's a little bit easier to see. So we're going to make this text area an actual Alpine component. Despite the fact that we have a component on the outer, this functionality that we want to build relates directly to the text area. So we're again going to initialize this text area with X data so we can go ahead and attach some properties in there to make sure that this works. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this working. Now we need to know within this text area if the shift key is being held. So let's first of all just go and implement a really naive event handler here. Let's say key down, or let's say key up, and basically what we want to do is submit this form when we have hit the enter key or the return key. So to do this, there's a couple of ways. What we could do is we could get the actual event in here, and we saw this a little bit earlier on in the series. So we could use event, check the key, and by that I mean if we just console log out the event that this actually triggers, when I hit the A key, for example, you can see we get a keyboard event through. That's going to give us the key code which we could use to compare. For example, if I just close this off and hit enter, you can see that we get the enter key. So we could use that to actually go ahead and submit the form. So if you were to do that, you would probably add an if statement in here. You would say event.code, for example, and you could say, well, if that equaled enter, then you could go ahead and submit the form. So in this case, what we're going to do is just console log out submit. We're not actually going to submit the form because there's a much easier way to do this. So there we go. Let's go over, hit enter. That submits. When I press any other key, it doesn't do anything. So we just get that submitted when the key code is enter. Now, rather than doing all of this, Alpine makes this super easy with modifiers. So we have modifiers, for example, like submitting the form and preventing the default behavior, which we do actually need in there. But for things like key up, we have key modifiers. So for example, this now will only be called or triggered when the enter key is pressed. Let's try it out by just console logging something out in here just to see. Let's go over, let's type in a load of characters, hit enter, and there we go. So we've pretty much got our functionality working. So we can use this to submit the form. How would we do that? We're going to talk about this special L property or object a little bit later. But essentially L is the element that we're currently working on. So if we just console log out L, a lot of console logging here, but it's important to do this just to kind of see what's going on. Let's hit enter, and there we go. We get the actual text area itself. So what we can do with this is this text area is presumably within a form. We could say L closest, which is native JavaScript, form, and then from this we want to go ahead and dispatch an event. And that event is going to be a new JavaScript event called submit. Now effectively what we're doing here is we're dispatching an event that's going to be picked up on our outer form. With this, it's going to prevent the default behavior and it's going to console log submitted. Let's go over and just try this out. I'm going to type a load of characters, hit enter, and at the moment that doesn't look like it's working, so let's have a look. Let's just give this a hard refresh. And there we go, that worked. I just needed to give that a hard refresh. So that's actually working. But obviously now what we want to do is allow the shift key, which I'm pressing right now as I'm speaking to you, to be held down to then go down. At the moment, holding the shift key and pressing enter still submits the form. So what we want to do is inside of this text area, inside of our data, keep a note on whether the shift key is being held. So let's say shift held false, because by default we'll assume it's not being held. And then what we can do is just attach more events onto here. So for example, we could say X on key down shift. So remember we have a modifier that allows us to detect which key is being held. If shift is being held, we can set shift held to true. So we're just modifying the property that we have here. And then what we could do is go ahead and say key up shift held, and we can set that to false. So now we can bring this together by only going ahead and dispatching this submit event to the closest form if the shift held is false. So we can just say if not shift held and go ahead and submit the form. So if the shift key is not being held, we go ahead and submit. So let's go ahead and say ABC enter, that submits it. Let's say ABC hold the shift key and go down, that's not being submitted. And then finally, when I'm ready to submit it, we submit that out. So there are loads of ways that you can pull functionality like this together, but it's just a good example of using a few events here with a couple of different modifiers just to get you used to how you're going to work with events in Alpine. So let's take a look at another example. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. This is actually going to be a simpler example. So this is going to be a menu, a drop-down menu that we want to open. We're not going to style this out because it's going to take a little while to do that. But let's go ahead and just create out a div in here with some data, and let's say open false. Now, if you followed along the rest of the series, you're probably thinking, well, this is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to have the menu content inside of here with a condition on this to only show if open is true. And then we're going to have some sort of button to actually open the menu. Well, you're right, but what happens if we want to close this menu by clicking outside of this menu content? Well, let's take a look now. So we're going to go ahead and get this working first of all, then we'll do a tiny bit of styling just so it makes more sense. So we're going to say when we click this button, we're going to set open to true. We're not going to toggle it. So this open menu button will not close this. Let's go over and just check this out. So at the moment we don't have any kind of condition on here. So let's say X show and only show that if it's open. And let's hit open menu and you can see that opens. Let's add some really simple styling to this just in line here. And let's just call this box just because I can't think of a better way to represent this right now. So let's say 200 pixels And let's make the height 200 pixels as well. And let's just set a background color here of slate gray or something like that. So let's go down and apply the class to this div box. Let's go over and check this out. Okay, so when I open it, there is the menu content. So you can kind of imagine that this is a kind of drop down at the top of your page. Now with this, I want to click anywhere outside of this box to close this off. So let's go over and look at how we can do that with Alpine. We want to use X on click. So this is on the actual menu content itself, that box that we've just created. But Alpine has a special outside modifier, which means that whenever we click anywhere outside this element, we trigger it. So let's say open, false. That's pretty much it. Let's go over and check this out. Hit open menu. Clicking anywhere inside of this, which is what I'm doing right now, doesn't do anything. As soon as I click anywhere outside, that goes ahead and gets rid of it. So you can see that we've pretty much, in a couple of minutes, built the functionality that would eventually end up as some sort of drop-down menu. Okay, so we've covered these events. A lot of these are in the documentation. So if you ever need to find a specific event, you can head over to the docs to find that out. But hopefully this gives you a really good overview of the kind of events that we can create, as well as their modifiers, and the kind of things that we can do with this really powerful functionality like this, just in a couple of lines of code. We're now going to look at really simple validation. I'm not using a Vuex store here. We're going to make this as uncomplicated as we possibly can. And to do this, what we'll do is inside of each component where we have a form, what we will also include are validation errors, which we'll get directly back from our API. So what we'll do is, just for now, and I tend to do this when I'm working with a validation setup, is I'll just output that at the top just so we can keep an eye on this. And what we want to do is, for this, we want to do a try catch. So I'm going to cut this out and just implement a try catch really quickly. And then I'm going to pop that inside of there. And then when we catch an error, if we log this out and say e.response.status, for example, we should see a 422 if we don't enter anything. So let's pop over to our console and just click sign in. And of course we see 422 logged out from that last request. So what we can now do is, and I wouldn't recommend this for larger projects, but this is just absolutely fine for medium projects, is check that the status is 422 and then go ahead and set the validation directly within here to e.response data errors. So data is going to be the actual payload back from the API, and then errors is that object that we need to assign to validation. So now that we've done that, if we go ahead and click sign in, you can see that we get our errors inside of here, and we can use the styles that we looked at earlier to add validation errors into here. So to do that then, what we want to do, now that we know that we've got this in here, is let's start with the label for this. So we want to bind a class in if we have a particular validation error, and that class is TextRed500. All we need to do is just say validation.email. So does that property exist? If it does, we know that we've got validation errors. Perfect. We can do a very similar thing with our class binding in here. And of course, what we want to do is set the border this time to red 500. And again, we can still use that validation property to access that. And then we can show this if there is a validation error. So all we need to do is say vif validation.email. Well, then we can grab from validation.email the first error, which is just at key 0. So we see the following: the email field is required. So super simple validation, and I do this on smaller to medium projects, and it works just as well. One last thing I'm going to do is actually just make this font medium. I think that will probably look a little bit nicer. There we go. Okay, so we can just really just copy this pattern now and do this for the password as well. So let's copy this down to here, and of course switch this over to password. Do the same thing for the border on the password field as well, like so. And again, change that to password, and again include the error message just in here underneath the input. And of course this just needs to change over to password. Okay, so let's hit sign in, and sure enough we get all of them errors in there. And remember earlier when we set up our response, if I type my incorrect password in here, you'll see that we get a validation error, could not sign you in with them details on the email address itself. You can change this around. You can do a separate check down here for a 401 if you want to. It's really up to you, but that's really, really basic validation. We're now going to take what we've learned about events and build our own simple modal functionality. So we click a button and it opens a modal. And within this, what we're also going to do is discuss dispatching our own custom events, which we can pick up from anywhere on the page. That's pretty much what we want to do with modals. We want some sort of button which triggers a global modal that we have on our page. Now this is really, really simple functionality, but with this example, you'll get the general idea and you'll be able to expand on it as you learn more about Alpine. So we've got nothing on the page at the moment. Let's first of all look at the markup and the actual styling. So we're going to have a kind of overall wrapper for our modal. So let's give this a class of modal wrapper. Again, we're just going to implement really simple styling here. And inside of this is going to be the actual modal window itself. Let's go ahead and just add some really quick styles just at the top here, just to get this started. So for the modal wrapper, let's go ahead and add the styles in for this now. This is going to have a position of absolute, so we can fix it to the very top and very bottom and left and right. And we'll set a width of 100%, a height of 100%, and let's go ahead and set a background color to this. And let's just use RGBA here and say black with an alpha of 0.5, so that's just half the opacity. So let's go over and just give that a refresh. And it doesn't look like anything's showing, so yeah, we just spelled modal wrong. Let's go ahead and update that, give that a refresh, and there we go. So that's our kind of modal wrapper. Now, just to make this a little bit better, let's set the margin on the body to 0, and there we go. So that's our background for our modal. Now the modal content itself, let's go ahead and add this in, spell it properly this time. Let's just set a width of 100% by default to this, and let's go ahead and set a max width on this of, let's just say 30%. We'll set the background color here to white, and let's go ahead and set some padding on this to 20 pixels. So let's go over and just give this a refresh, and there we go. So there is our actual modal. Now to make this in the center, let's just add a display of flex to our overall modal wrapper, and let's align these items centrally, and let's justify this content in the center as well. So we basically just end up with a modal in the middle. Great. So let's add some just content to our modal. It doesn't really matter what it is. So I'm a modal, and there we go. Great. So that's our modal. Very, very simple. So let's hide this by default. And of course we want to hide the entire thing. So let's add some X data onto this, and let's say open and false. What we can do now, if we just pull each of these lines down just to make this a little bit tidier, we can go ahead and add an X show to this and say if it's open. By default it's not, so we just won't see anything, but we'll have some kind of button outside of this component which will go ahead and trigger that modal. So let's go ahead and add that in now, and we'll look at that in a minute because that involves dispatching a custom event and picking that up on the window object, which sounds more complicated than it is with Alpine. Now, if we go ahead and just focus on the modal itself first of all, let's set open to true, and let's figure out how we would close this modal. Now, typically within a modal, you would have two methods of closing this. You'd either click outside anywhere in this dark area, outside of the main modal content, so I could click here or here to close this off, or I would press escape on my keyboard, which I've just done, but of course at the moment nothing is happening. So let's focus on clicking outside. We covered that in the last episode. So what we can do is on the actual modal itself, the white box, we can say X on and click, use the outside modifier and set open to false. So if we come over and give this a refresh, clicking inside of the modal does nothing. Anywhere outside of that closes it off. So already just with, again, a couple of events here and a property to show whether this is open, we've got some really nice modal functionality. Now what we want to do is add the escape event. We kind of already know how to do this. So let's go ahead and do this on the overall modal wrapper. And let's say on key up, use the escape modifier and set open to false. Let's check it out. So let's go over, give this a refresh. I'm going to click outside just to make sure that's still working. I'm going to press escape on my keyboard, and nothing is actually happening. So by pressing escape on my keyboard, which I'm doing repeatedly right now, it's still not doing anything. Let's find out why that is. So when we do press on key up escape, remember that this is a div. It's not actually an input. So if this was a text area, that would work because we are currently inputting content into that text area. So what we're going to do is look at a further modifier, which is on the window object. So if we get a global escape key down, this will listen globally, then do what we ask. So if you're applying keys or events anywhere, globally, you need to use this window modifier. Let's give this a refresh. I'm going to hit escape on my keyboard, and there we go. The modal has been closed. So we can kind of use what we've learned about that window modifier to trigger the modal. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's go ahead and on this button, use xData, so we can actually use this as an Alpine component. Bear in mind at this point, this is a separate component to this modal. We wouldn't want this button inside of the actual modal itself, so we're having this completely separate. So let's go ahead and say on click. Now this is where we want to trigger the modal. How would we do that? Because we're not within this component. We can't say something like open true because there's no open property on this button. We could add that in there, but it would be useless. We want to control this component regardless of where this button that triggers the modal is. So what we can actually do within Alpine is we can dispatch an event globally. So let's go ahead and just call this open modal. You can call that whatever you want. It doesn't matter what you use. So let's go over and try this out. Now let's first of all make sure we set open to false, so we don't have that by default. And by clicking on that, we have now triggered an event. We can't see anything happening, but we can pick up on this event from any of the Alpine components or even within native JavaScript. So we're going to go ahead and say X on. Now we have a custom event name. We can say open modal. So that's our custom event. Now let's go ahead and again say open to true and guess whether this is going to work or not. You probably already guessed it's not. Clicking on this does absolutely nothing. That's again because we have dispatched an event on the window object, which means we need that window modifier. So let's try this out. I'm going to go ahead and hit trigger modal. That opens, and now we have built some very simple modal functionality with just a few events. Now this doesn't directly relate to this modal, but I'm going to give you an example of sending data along with your events as well, which could be really important. So let's say that we had just a wrapper. I'm just going to have a contrived example here where we had some kind of message that we wanted to show. By default that was empty. And actually this could be some kind of pop-up like a message in the bottom of the screen telling a user that they've performed some sort of action. We might actually cover this as a practical example. I think that would be good. But let's go ahead and just get this working for now. So with this message, what I want is some sort of button. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a button. To go ahead and say, well, when I click this, I want to dispatch an event called message, and I want to send some data along with this to be set inside of here. So how do we do that? Well, simply with dispatch, we can send data as a second argument. So I can say hello there. So let's just go ahead and say set message on this button. Let's go over. The goal of this is when I click on this, it sets the message within this other component and outputs it in here. So let's output the message which is at the moment just empty. So let's say X text message, and just to double check that that actually is outputting, there it is. Now we want to pick up this event on here. So we're going to say X on message window, remember. Now we want to set the message to the data that we get here. So how do we do that? Well, let's go ahead and console log on the event object, first of all, that we get through from any event that we have in Alpine. And let's see where that data is actually being sent through to. So let's give that a hard refresh, hit set message, and it's not actually working. So let's have a look here. And yeah, we didn't add xData to our button, so that's not actually an Alpine component and it's not being triggered. So by clicking set message, we get a custom event. So that's what's going to be created when Alpine uses the dispatch method. Now in here, you can see you've got detail, which is at the moment just a string. Now that could be an object. We'll take a look at that in just a second. But in this case, we can just go ahead and set the message from that event property. So we can say message equals and assign event detail. and let's go over, hit set message, and there we go. So effectively from another location, we've sent a message across to another component and set the message there. And like I said, you can use objects here. So for example, I could say message is hello there, and you might have some other data like the type of message. For example, that could be an error. So we'll just keep the message in there for now, but let's go ahead and say event.detail.message, because that's now an object that exists within detail. Let's go over, give that a refresh, and you can see it works in exactly the same way. So a practical example plus a taste of dispatching your own events inside of one component and picking them up in another component, which can be really useful aside from Alpine's state management functionality to share data between different components. One thing that you'll want to do for each of your pages, and this isn't vital to this actually working, but it's useful to do, is add some metadata. So at the moment, this just says client, and the reason for that is over in the Nuxt config for our head property here, this just uses the package name. So what I'd recommend you do is first of all change this over. So you could just go ahead and say snippets by code course, which is how it's displayed on the production site, or you could take this from your env file if you wanted to. Either way, that will change that over globally for all pages. But of course, what you'll want to do is override your individual pages titles. So to do this, what you're going to do is just define out the head property. Now what I tend to do is create this as a method, and then I return an object from this. The reason for that is, and the reason I get into the habit of that, is if you need to return any data inside of here from any things you have inside of your component, this is how you're going to do it. We'll be looking at that later, so don't worry too much if that doesn't make sense for now. But either way, I'm going to set sign in here and head over, and sure enough, we get the page just here, sign in. Now what happens if you want to still keep your snippets by code course, or whatever you want to call this, inside of your title? Well, for that, what we use is a title template. So for this, what we can do is we can have a string in here and then snippets by code course afterwards if you want to. Now I'm just going to set that to snippets, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the title over on the index page. So bear with me, I'll demonstrate this in just a minute. I'm going to go ahead and return from here title snippets by code course. So that is the home page title, but then for any other pages, we're just going to display whatever we're displaying in here, e.g. sign in, then a hyphen, and then snippets. So what this ends up doing is creating the following. So let's just wait for the config to reload. Sign in hyphen snippets, but when we're on the home page, we get snippets by code course, and then we do get hyphen snippets after that. So what we can actually do is over on the home page, if we want to get rid of this, we can set the title template either to null or an empty string. So that gets rid of that like so. So over on the sign in page, we see sign in snippets, and over on the home page, we just see snippets by code course. So I will probably forget to add the titles for some other pages, except for the actual snippet page, which is really important because we're going to display the snippet up there. But that's pretty much how you're going to want to set up your metadata using the view meta package, which is accessed by this head method or head property. We briefly looked at L earlier, which references the current component that Alpine is on. However, what we're going to do in this part is look at two really cool examples of how we can use this. Just to kind of refresh your memory, let's create out a div in here, set x data, and let's go ahead and say x init, and just console log out L. I don't think we've looked at x init yet, but all that does is run something in here when this component initializes. Let's go over and check this out. You can see that sure enough, we get that div back. This of course can apply to any component. So for example, if this was a text area, it would work in the same way. It just gives you that component back, or that element back. Okay, so let's look at two cool examples. The first one is going to be an instant markdown outputter. That's the only way I can describe it. So let's go ahead and create some div out here, and let's say x data, and let's again use x init. We can actually get rid of the assignment on x data, And I've already pulled the marked library in that we looked at a little bit earlier. Effectively, I want to transform any content that's within this div into Markdown. So for example, this is Markdown. And if we go over and give that a refresh, at the moment, of course, it just doesn't work because we just have 2 asterisks and nothing's being parsed. Now inside of Xinit, what we can now do is access L, and because that's a native element and we can access any of the properties on it via JavaScript, we could, for example, say inner HTML, and we could set that to any value. So I could just set that to ABC, and when this is initialized, it just changes over to ABC. But that gives us the opportunity to use the marked library to go ahead and take the inner text of this, again via L, inner text, and transform it into Markdown. So if we go over, give that a refresh, there we go. We get this is Markdown, being transformed into Markdown. So I wouldn't recommend doing this over and over again for lots of different components. You'd probably have a huge block of Markdown within one component, but it's good to see that this can be done in just pretty much one line of code. Now the next example we're going to look at is an element on the page which we can copy and paste by clicking on it. So let's go and start with just a div in here, and I want any of the content inside of here, maybe it's an API key, something, to be copied and pasted when we click on that text. So again, let's go ahead and bring Xdata in just to initialize this component, and let's use a click event in here to copy and paste the content within this particular element. Now we can do this just natively with JavaScript, so we're going to go ahead and say window navigator and clipboard, and we're going to go ahead and write some text to the clipboard when this is clicked. And that is, of course, is from this element, the inner text of this element. Let's go over and try this out. When I click on this and come over to my editor, that has now been copied and pasted. So really, really simple way to have some element within your site that you can copy and paste content from. Now this would work in the same way as if it were an input. Let's just try that out now. So let's go ahead and create an input in here just with a type of text. Let's set an initial value to this. So that's probably going to be, again, some kind of API key or whatever content you want us to copy. And let's replicate exactly the same content. So X on click, and then in here we're going to say L. In fact, let's console log that element out because this is slightly different. Each element has a different way to access content. In this case, it was inner text, but in this case, it's going to be the value of this element. So let's go and just click in here, and there we go. We have the value in there. But to access this, we want to go and extract the value out rather than the inner text. So we can do exactly the same thing. Window, navigator, clipboard, and write text. And we can say L.value. There we go. Now let's go over, click in here. That's going to go and copy and paste that content. Just to make sure that's working, what we can do is change this up a bit. So let's just say A, B, C, D, E, F. Let's go over and click, and there we go. That is working nicely. If, for example, you also wanted to select all the text when this was clicked, you could do that as well. So you could say L.select at the end of there, or you could do that before, it doesn't really matter. Now when I click in here, the whole text gets selected and also gets copied as well. So you could show a message in there to say that that had been copied, use a tooltip, it doesn't really matter. But just with that and using L allows us to reference a component like this where we attach Xdata directly to the component and do all these cool things. Okay, so let's dive into scaffolding out the snippet page so we can start to make this work. First thing that we're going to do is create the page itself. So the way that we want this to work is to use /snippets, and you can see that I've already got a UUID here. We'll eventually generate a UUID on the back end when these are created, but for now we'll just put one in there. So essentially we want snippets and then an ID to be passed in. So to achieve this in Nuxt, we just create a snippets directory, and we can either create a id.view file. What I prefer to do is create an ID folder and then an index.view file in there. That's just my personal preference, just in case I need to add anything else to ID, so I don't need to shift too much around. So let's build out our template in here. We'll just make this really basic for now. And we'll just say snippet, and let's come over and check this out. Great, so that looks like it's working. Now, of course, we know that we need a container on the outer part of this just to center everything in the middle. And that looks good to me. Great. Okay, so let's focus first of all on the top title part of this. So what I'm actually going to do, because we're going to have two different kind of sections to this page, I'm just going to split this out with an overall outer div, and this will be the top title part, which will have a white background. In fact, we can actually get rid of the container class and just start to add a background of white in here, and then we can add the container inside of this, so we basically end up with something like the following. So what we want to do then is just add a little bit of padding here. So I'm going to say maybe padding on the y-axis to 10, and then we could say on the bottom we want to increase this to 16, so we have a little bit more room, and that will just give us something like the following. So it just spaces out between the navigation and the bottom of the container. Now inside of here is just going to go the snippet title. So what I'm actually going to do is create another div in here. I don't want to nest too many divs, but I want a width of 10 out of 12. What that will allow me to do is create a header, but that header won't exceed too much width of the page. So let's pop the snippet title inside of here, which of course we don't have at the moment. And let's just start to style this text out. So let's say 4XL, we want this to be quite big. Again, let's grey the text slightly, and we'll make this a font medium. I'm also going to set the leading to tight or none. That will get rid of the line spacing, or severely reduce the line spacing, so we don't have too much of a shift in height due to that. So that looks good to me. Just underneath this, we want a author in here. So let's maybe just say text grey 600, and let's say created by, and then let's create a Nuxt link in here. Let's end that Nuxt link as well. And we can of course bring this down as we usually would. Let's put this to absolutely nowhere at the moment, and let's just pop a name inside of here, like so. So that will be created by Alex Garrett Smith. So now that we've got that, let's add some margin bottom, and that should be just about it. So there we go. That is our top title with our link through to the author. Now just underneath this container, or just underneath this outer background white, we want another div, and this is going to have a class of container, because of course we want to put all of our content inside of there, and this is where all of our snippet stuff is going to go. So we could either add a margin top on here, or we could add a margin bottom on here, just to kind of space things out a little bit. I think that looks about good to me. So basically we're keeping the same spacing on the bottom of this as we are on the kind of bottom of this, so it sits nicely and evenly. Okay, so inside of this container, this is the most difficult part. So essentially what we want is a header one here, or it doesn't really matter which element we use, but we want the kind of 1 out of 1 step 1. So this will be the title of the step. So I could even call this step title. That's going to sit there, and then everything else is going to sit underneath this. So the step title is always going to sit just up there. So let's go ahead and style this up. Let's say text extra large. Again, let's grey the text a little bit and set the font to medium, and we'll set a margin bottom of 6. So anything underneath that will, of course, just sit nicely underneath. So now underneath this, we can have a div with a class of flex, and this is where our 2-column layout will be. So we're going to have one left-hand side here, and we're going to have one right-hand side here. So let's just style these up so we know that this is working. So at this point, it's probably a good idea to bring up our device toolbar and just see how this is looking. Let's start on a mobile viewport, and we'll work our way out from there. I know we didn't do that with the navigation, but for this page, it's slightly more complicated, so it makes sense to start on a mobile layout. So for these on a mobile layout, we're going to want these to be a full width, and we want this one to be full width as well. What we then want to do is, as we go up to large, we want to make this say 4 out of 12. So let's just fix that up in there, and we'll say width 4 out of 12. And I think that should just be about it. For this one, we can then say large width 8 out of 12. And then on a large viewport, we can put a margin right of say 16 as well. So they're sitting next to each other at the moment. That's just because we don't have flex wrap set on here. And of course, on a large viewport, we want to set flex no wrap, which is really important. So they're going to sit underneath each other until it's big enough to display this on the left and this on the right. So this will be the kind of display area, and this will be the step area where we display our steps. Okay, so let's focus on the actual section here, the left-hand section, and then we'll get to outputting the steps. So inside of here, we want our markdown. So this will be the markdown content from the step that we've created. Remember, this isn't the editor, this is how we display something. So the class for this, we'll just set the background to white. We'll do the standard stuff like add some padding. We'll set rounded to large just to make it a little bit more rounded. And we'll set text to gray 600. And we'll also make the width full on this as well. So let's head back over and check that out. And that looks okay to me. Great. So let's pull this over and that looks okay. So our goal now is to get an arrow here and an arrow here. And then when we pull them like this, we want the arrows to sit here and here. So that sounds quite tricky to do. It is a little bit tricky to do, but we can achieve this just with Flexbox. So let's just kind of roughly mark this out first of all. And just inside of here, I'm going to create a div. And then inside of here is going to be a Nuxt link. And of course, later on, what that will do is link through to the previous and next. So what I'll do for now is create maybe a left arrow. And we'll set the to property on here to nothing. And then we'll create a right arrow down here in a similar way. So at the moment, we'll end up with the following, just above and below our markdown content. Now that's not what we want. We want this to sit up here and then this can stay in its own place. So we need to figure out how to do this. And then when we pull it out, we want this to sit here and this to sit here. Now on a large viewport, that's pretty straightforward. All we need to do is on the outer container for this, set the flex property, and that will automatically pull them up like this. But when we go into a smaller viewport, like I said, we want this to be at the top and this to be at the top. So what we're going to do is we're going to set flex wrap on this, and on large, we'll then say flex no wrap. We'll go ahead and say justify between, and we'll say item start. And let's come over and have a look at this. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. So it's pulling up and then wrapping down as we wanted. But what we need to do is this one here, we can say order first. And then this one here, we can say order first. And let's just take a look at what that's done. Great, so that's pulled that like that. And unfortunately, it still stays in the same position on large, but on a mobile viewport, that's exactly what we want. On a large viewport, what we want to do with the last one is say large order last. So let's just have a look at that. And there we go. So when we pull this down now, they're up there. And when we pull it out, they're next to each other. Perfect. So let's actually make these into icons, just so we have something to play around with. And to do this, we're going to be using the Hero Icons UI icon set. I already have the SVG copied, but I'm going to go through the steps of how you might want to just pop these into your code. There are other ways that you can do this, much better ways that you can do this using SVG loaders with Webpack. But for now, we'll just keep things as they are. So we want a left arrow for this. So let's say icon arrow left, and that should just about do. What I tend to do when I'm just either scaffolding things out or I just have a very small project is I take the SVG code and I put it directly into here. And what I'm going to do is get rid of the class because we don't need that. We don't need to style it up using a class. And I also get rid of the width and height. And what we can now do is start to add some class information onto here. Now for the Nuxt link, we're going to want this to have a background. So let's go ahead and add a class into here as well. And let's just style this up. So I'm going to say block and I'm going to say margin bottom 2 because we're going to have other icons in there. Set padding 3. Let's set the background to blue 500. Let's say rounded large, if I can spell that correctly. And let's say margin right 2 because we'll have other things sitting next to it as well. So that's going to give us the following. Let's just come over here. I'm not going to bother copying any more of them. So we've got our little button there now. But with the icon, we want to go ahead and style this up as well. So we're first of all going to say fill current because we want to color this with text. What Tailwind will do is if you use fill current combined with a text color, it will fill the SVG with the color you've defined in text. And then we can just add a height and a width to this. And you end up with something like the following. So that looks okay to me. So we've got the arrow there now, and of course with that margin on the right that we added and the margin on the bottom that we added, that is looking good. So we can do more or less the same thing here with this link. So let's copy and paste this over. Let me just pull over the code that I already have for this, just so we can save some time. But essentially that SVG is going to look like that. So that is just the right arrow, and I've used exactly the same method and I've applied exactly the same classes. So we now have a right arrow. So pulling that up like this looks like the following. Now, of course, we've got a spacing issue here. So what we can do is come over, and on this, we can set a margin on the left to 2, or it might work a little bit better if we skip that actually and apply it to the markdown content. So maybe we could say on a large viewport, we want a margin right of 2. And let's have a look at that. That looks a little bit better. And as we pull that in, that works nicely. Now we're going to have another icon in here. So what I want to do is inside of here, create another Nux link just underneath here. This will be to edit the step. So on the link itself, I'm actually going to add a title called edit step. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull over the SVG for the edit icon. Again, I used exactly the same method, copied over the direct source from this, gone ahead and pasted it in, and I've applied exactly the same styles, so we get the exact same icon styles. So we've now got an edit icon just there. Now let's just check what happens when we go down to a smaller viewport. Doesn't look great at the moment, so this is absolutely fine. Of course, we're going to show this when the user has permission to edit the particular snippet that they're viewing. But when we pull this in, we kind of want these two to sit next to each other. So to achieve that, what we can do is on the outer wrapper for these two icons, we can fiddle around with the flex display. So let's go ahead and first of all say flex. Let's say flex row. So let's just see the difference that that has made. That looks good to me. When we pull this out, however, we're still seeing that sitting next to each other. So that's not what we want. And of course, we're going to set a margin right of 2 on this one. So that comes out nicely. Okay, so now what we want to do is on a mobile, this is fine, but on a desktop, we want these to sit underneath each other. So what we can do is apply some large styles to this and say flex col, and you end up with the following. Now, we've got a little bit of an issue here. We'll fix that up in just a second, but now you can see as we pull that down, they're sitting nicely next to each other. So let's fix up this issue with this spacing just here. And the reason that this is happening, and I can demo in the browser, is we have a margin right on this, and this means this is filling the width. Now we can either change the display property or change up the flex property, or what we could do is we could say, well, on a large viewport, I want the margin right to be 0 on this particular icon, and that will just fix that issue. So it's just trying to fill up the available space. Okay, so that looks good to me. We can now see this on a smaller viewport where we can click either of these icons, but on a larger viewport, we get the following. What you could even do is have the edit button sit before this icon, because when I click on the left here and then I go immediately over here, I'm probably just going to accidentally click the icon here. So what I could do is say order first on here. Let's take a look at that. You can see that that's shifted around. And then when we open this up, we can fix that up in just a minute. So we could say large order last. And then we could fiddle around with the spacing on here. So now that that is the case, we want the margin right to be applied to this, and we end up with the following, and we can get rid of the margin right on this one, like so, and we end up with this. Great. So we've now got a nice responsive version of our step navigation. So if we come over and let's look where we are at the moment, we are going to split this out into separate components. Let's create a div in here with a class of margin bottom 8, because we're going to have a little note down here about the keyboard navigation, which we're going to implement a little bit later. And inside of here, let's create an H1 and let's say text XL. In fact, we can copy the styles from, let's have a look here from this, because I want it to be very, very similar to this. So let's copy the styles over for that, and let's say steps. So that's going to give us our step information. And then just underneath this, let's create an unordered list with a list item, and this will iterate through each of the steps. So what I'll actually do is I'll say V4, and I'll say step index in, let's say 5. let's give this a key, and we'll key it by the index, so that'll iterate over so we can see what these look like in a list. And then we'll have a Nux link in here, and that will eventually go to navigate to the step that we've clicked on. So this will be in here, step title. And if we just take a look at that, we end up with the following. I'm going to keep this pretty straightforward. So for the list item, let's again pull all these properties down, and let's give this a class of margin bottom 1. And then for the link itself, let's go ahead and just bind in a class, and we'll say that we want it to be font bold if the index equals 0. Now that's just a test to kind of highlight the first one, but eventually this comparison here will check if we're on the current step. And what we also probably want to do here, which we don't really need to change later, is say index plus 1, and that will just give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that works well, I think. Okay, so let's just pull this in just to make sure everything's looking good. And of course we've got a little spacing issue here. So just on the container that we created here, let's just pull this in a little bit. So just on this one here, let's add a margin on the bottom of, let's think, say 8. And that looks okay to me. And then when we pull this out, we don't need to worry about removing that margin bottom on a large viewport because there's no other content underneath this. Okay, so just to finish up, I'm just going to create underneath the component here a little note about navigation in the keyboard. So let's say text gray 500 and text small, and in here let's say use, and let's think of the the keyboard hotkeys and combinations we want. Control plus shift plus left or right on your keyboard to navigate between steps, like so. And we end up with the following. Now just while we're developing, let's come over to app.css. On the body, let's apply a padding bottom of say 16, just so we have a little bit of space to check this out. There we go, that's a bit better. So I want these to be styled as hotkeys. This is going to be a little bit messy, but we can refactor these to components a little bit later. And essentially what we want is to wrap these in a div. We're going to apply a class of inline block because of course we want these to sit in line with the text. We'll say padding on the X of 2. Let's set the leading to relaxed just to make sure that there's no extra spacing there. And let's set the text gray to 600. And let's make these rounded, and we'll give these a grey background of 400, and we'll make the text small. I think that will just about do it. So we end up with the following. So just kind of representing keys on the keyboard. And we can do the same thing here with each of these hotkeys. And like I said, we can go ahead and extract these out to components later so we don't have too much repetition. But I think for now that's absolutely fine. So let's go and say the same for left and right, or left or right, and apply them same classes in there. There we go. So I think that's okay. We've got a nice responsive page now where we can browse through the steps. We've got a list of the steps which we can click on, and we've got an edit button that will be available for anyone who actually owns the step. And of course we've got our header just up there as well. So pretty simple page. We've done a lot of the work now, because when we look at the snippet edit page, we can copy a lot of this across, and then we can start to do a little bit of component splitting after that. We're now going to take a look at watching, which allows us to watch when a property within an Alpine component changes. So let's take a look at a contrived example here. Let's go ahead and initialize this with some data, and let's just pull this down so we can create some methods out, because we're going to need an xinit method or an init method in here to get this to work. So within our data, let's just say that we had a message in here. Just keep this really simple to start with. And then let's go and create out an init method, which, as we've seen through the rest of the series, will run when this component initializes. So let's just add some content in there just to see this working. So if we come over, give that a refresh, sure enough, we get ABC logged out. Now what we can do within init is we can watch for this message being changed. At the moment, it probably won't make much sense, but in a moment, we're going to look at a more practical example of watching for a query change and performing a search. So to watch something, we're going to go ahead and use watch. The first argument is the property that we want to watch, which in this case is just message. The second is the callback of what we want to do when this property changes. Let's go ahead and just console log out something, and let's say changed. Okay, so what we can do is either add a button in here to change this message. So let's just say change message, and let's add an on-click handler, and let's just set the message to something else, like so. Okay, so let's get rid of the watcher for now, just to see that message change, and we could probably go ahead and do with outputting that just in here with X text. There we go, and let's have a look. There we go, that changes. Let's bring that watcher back and let's see what happens. There we go, so we get changed. Now when we do call this callback, this actually gives us the value of the item that's been changed. So we could say changed and also log out the value as well. Let's go ahead and do that, and you can see changed, and that's to something else. So if you needed that value, you could go ahead and grab it from there as well. Now that's the basics of watching, but let's look at an example of where we might want to practically use watching. Of course, it could be used for absolutely anything, but we're going to do this in the context of a search. In the next episode, we're actually going to bring this together and do a full search on some kind of API. So let's go ahead and output our X data here, and inside of here we're going to have a query which we can update via an input, and we can use X model for this. So let's hook that up to the query, and in here we might have some kind of perform search method. So let's go ahead and collect up some results, and for now we're not actually hitting an API, so I'm just going to manually set these results to a couple of things in an array: apple, banana, and grapes. That will do. Okay, so when we go ahead and start typing, that is when we want to perform the search. We want this to be like an instant search. So let's go ahead and just really roughly output the results. We're not actually going to iterate through them. So let's say results, and let's go over and give that a refresh. So when I start typing in here, I want the search to perform instantly. Our first instinct might be to say X on key down or key up, and then go ahead and perform the search. Let's actually use key up here. So let's go over and give this a refresh. When I start typing, we get the results back. And of course, in reality, this would actually hit some sort of API to bring back the results, set them here, and then of course what we would do is iterate through them. Now this is absolutely fine for most instances, but what we ideally want to do is only perform the search when the query is updated, not on key up or key down. If we had multiple inputs, for example, or we had other event handlers on here that we needed to use for key up and key down, this is a little bit too tightly coupled to performing the search. So what we're going to do instead is bring back our init method, and we're going to go ahead and watch the query, and when that changes, then we're going to perform the search. So it's completely independent to what's being hooked up to that model. So let's go ahead and say this watch. Let's watch the query, and then we know that inside of the callback that we get here, we get the actual query, and then we can go ahead and perform the search. And to perform the search, we might want to take in a query to actually send through to our API. So let's go ahead and say perform search query, and that will have exactly the same effect. But now we've decoupled it from the key up or key down event on that input. If we go over and start to search again, you can see it works in exactly the same way. Let's head over to the next episode and look at a practical example of actually creating a real drop-down search, which allows us to perform a search based on a public API. So we have the snippet view page. What we now want to do is pretty much just copy this over to a new view page and have some kind of edit page. And this will allow us to fill in the title, fill in each of the step titles, and of course, really importantly, have a little input just above here, which allows us to edit the content of each step, and everything else will remain the same. We will see a little bit of duplication just for now, but we can always change that up a little bit later. So let's just take the entirety of this page. Like I said, there'll be a little bit of duplication. I'm going to go ahead and create an edit folder inside of this ID just here, and then I'm going to create an index.view file inside of here. You can do just create an edit file if you want to. You don't have to create edit and then index. You can do exactly what you want. It really doesn't matter. So let's go over to /edit and we should see exactly the same thing. Great. Okay, so what we now want to do, we're just going to start with a snippet title. That kind of makes sense. We'll have here, instead of an H1, we'll have an input. So why don't we just grab this, pop this at the top here, and just switch this over to an input type of text. Keep these side by side just so we can see that they are working nicely. And of course, we're not going to have a title there, but we are going to have a value. So I'm going to say snippet title, just so we can see that value in there. So this kind of looks similar, and you can see now we can edit this, but there are a couple of differences here. The main one is the font that's used. So if we come over and say font header in here instead, we should see that go. So these look pretty much identical now. Of course, the only difference is this one is editable. There's a couple of other things that we want to add to this. So for example, we want this to be a full width here. So I'm going to say width full and I'm going to say block. So let's come back over to here and check this out. That looks okay to me. And we want a little bit more padding in here. So let's set the padding here to 2. And while we're at it, let's set the border to 2 as well. And we'll just see what that does. So you can see that's put a little border around it. What we can also then do is say that we want this to be rounded, and we could say border dashed. And I'm just picking these in any order, it doesn't really matter. So there we go, we can clearly see now this is some kind of editable section. And of course we can go ahead and type this in. What I also want to do, and I'm just going to pull each of these down, is add a placeholder in here. Because every time we see a snippet without a title, we want this to be called untitled snippet. So I'm just going to pop that in there. So as soon as we launch into a new snippet page, this is exactly what we're going to see. And we can start typing the snippet title in there. And of course that will all be auto saved in the background. So let's come back over and get rid of this header here because we don't need that anymore. And let's get rid of the value in here. In fact, I'm just going to set the value to an empty string just for now. Okay, so we want to do a very similar thing with this step title here. So let's go down to where we have this step title. We want 1 out of 1 or 1 out of 5, whatever it's going to be, but then we want the input next to this. We don't want this part to be editable. So again, let's just start from scratch, and I'm going to create a flex enabled container here, and let's say flex center or item center. And then inside of here, we're going to have the text here. So let's pop that in there. That won't be an H1. We can just set that to be some kind of div. Doesn't really matter too much. And then the actual step title part of this will go underneath that. And of course, that's going to be an input with a type of text. So let's add some classes, or let's add the value into here just first of all. We can add some classes in just a moment. So we end up with the following. So it doesn't look great at the moment, but of course we can figure this out as we go. Okay, so what we want is to get rid of the margin bottom on the header just there. That will go ahead and fix that. Instead, we can set the margin bottom on the outer container to pull that down nicely. And then for the input, I'm again going to pull each of these properties down just so they're a little bit clearer. And we can keep that in there. We can also add the placeholder in here and say untitled step. That's what I want it to read. And let's get rid of this step title as well. So I'm going to get rid of the ID and the name. And for the classes here, we're going to set the text to extra large. We're basically just going to do the same as this really. So let's just copy this over to here and take a look at it. That looks a lot better to me. We could also set the margin right here to something like 3. And then we could do pretty much what we did over here. So we could set the padding to 2, border to 2, rounded and border dashed. Let's go ahead and pull that over to here and just see what that looks like. And there we go, that looks okay to me. We could probably get away with just setting the padding on the y-axis to 1, just to reduce that slightly. Great. And while we're here, why don't we just change the background to transparent. I think that looks a little bit better in terms of the step editing. So now I can type in step 1, and that should update each of these steps when we get to it. Great. Okay, so the last thing that we want to do then is create the actual input here for the step content. And we also need another button, so we need a delete button. let's come down to where we had this markdown content. And the way that this is going to work is eventually we're going to split this up into a completely separate component. And then in here, we're going to have the markdown content here. And then down here, well, we're going to have the markdown content at the bottom. And at the top, we're going to have the actual editor itself. So let's pull the markdown content into this kind of overall wrapper because we want these to kind of fit together. And the class on here is basically just going to be width full like that. And then we're going to have another editor in there. So let's just check out. Great. So we've got our editor, and what this should do, if we just inspect this, is still fit together nicely when we're editing. So that should still pull down there in exactly the same way. So that looks okay to me. Great. Okay, so for the editor itself then, let's go ahead and just very quickly style this out. So this is going to have a width of full. Eventually this is going to be a text area because of course we want to edit this. So let's actually switch this over to a text area now, but we are going to be using a actual code editor for this, as we saw in the introduction. So I'm going to set a margin bottom 6. We'll do exactly the same thing. So we'll set border to dashed and border to 2. And let's set the border to grey 400. We can also edit some of them other ones as well. And we'll set rounded to large, or just rounded. Let's set it to large and just see what we get. Okay, so let's come back over. Obviously, it just looks a little bit odd at the moment because we've got editor here with all this spacing, which is being taken into account. So we can just pull this up and even get rid of that for now. It doesn't really matter too much. Now, there is a little bit of a spacing issue here, but we'll fix that up later because, like I said, this will eventually be a code editor. Okay, so now that we've got these two, let's just change the border color on all the others. I did forget to do that. So let's say border gray 400. So let's do that for our step here. And let's do this for our overall title as well, just to make that a little bit clearer. And I think that is about it. So we have got, well, we need to add our delete button. We'll do that in a second. We've got our editor here, which we can type stuff into, which we'll look at in more detail later. We can still navigate. It's still responsive. We can fill in the title, the name of each step, which is great. And let's just get that delete button in here really quickly. And we can actually replace this out with this edit button because we don't need an edit button in our edit view. So if we come down to this edit step, let's change this over to delete step. And I'm going to go ahead and grab the SVG for this from hero icons, but I'm just going to pull over the pre-styled SVG as we've already seen. So we've already seen how to pull these in directly into the template. Okay, so we also do need the add step buttons, which is of course really important. So let's look at adding these in now. Let's go back over to our editor and let's just copy over our navigation buttons. So we've got, I believe it's this one here. Let's pop that in there. And we can always figure out where to put these a little bit later. Let's pull over an SVG from hero icons, exactly the same way, styled up in exactly the same way as well, same height, the same width, and the same color. And let's just check this out. Okay, so we've got an add button there. I'm just trying to think, would the add button work best here or here? I think probably underneath this. So let's pull this and pop it underneath. And that looks okay to me. Great. So let's just go and pull in our device view. Pull this in, and that looks okay to me. Of course, all we need is to add in a margin on the right of 2 to this. Great. So let's pull this out. And of course, we need to get rid of that margin. So that only needs to be on a small or medium viewport. And that looks good to me. Great. And we're going to do exactly the same thing over on this side as well. So let's go ahead and grab that plus icon there and let's pop this just, let's see where we put it. So let's pop this underneath this one just here. And of course, we just need to get rid of the margin right on a large viewport. And there we go. Let's just check this out quickly. Okay, so with this then, what we can do is add in some flex properties to this. So let's say flex row and then large flex column. So that what that will do is on a small viewport, it will set that to a flex display of row. And then of course, when we get large, it will be in a column. Perfect. And then what we can do rather than doing this, well, actually we can keep that, but we can add a margin right on this as well. And we should end up with the following. Great. And that just really needs to be a margin right of 2. Let's check that out. Okay, great. So that looks okay to me. Let's pull this in. And that looks good to me as well. Now we've still got this issue with this arrow here. So if we pull this out again, I want this to be on this side. So I want that to stay on the very right hand side. So let's just check this out over in code. And what I'm actually going to do while I'm here is I'm going to add a title to each of these links. So this one here is next step, and then we have add step after, and then we have delete step. So let's add this to the other icons as well, just so we can see the order of them. So this one is add step before, and then this one is previous step. So to fix up the order of this then, what we can actually do is just get rid of order first and order last on here, and we should see that keep like this, which is absolutely fine. What we could then do is on the overall container, we can say flex row reverse, and we end up with the following. Great. Okay, I think that's fine for now. Let's just add in a margin right on our plus button. And that looks good to me. Great. So on a large viewport, we've got the navigation. We've got the ability to add a step before and after the current step. Of course, when we're on the first step, we'll have to get rid of this, and we'll deal with this later. When we are on a smaller viewport, this still looks good. So we've still got the navigation either side, but we've also got the ability to add and delete, which is brilliant. And I think that looks good, to be honest. I guess the last thing, we could just make this step thing full width. So let's come over to where we have this, and let's say width full. There we go. I think that looks okay. And then of course we can enter a step as long as we need it to be. Let's again just pull this into a smaller viewport just to check that that's all okay. And that looks great to me. Okay, brilliant. We can always make some changes to this later, but for now, that is our step edit page done. Let's pull together some of what we've learned and create an instant search which searches the Hacker News API. Let's go ahead and start to perform a query here and see how it works, and then we'll build this out from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and start typing in here for Alpine.js. You can see a couple of things happening. We get a search status here, how many results are being returned, the actual query that we're searching for, and of course, most importantly, a list of items from Hacker News. And once you have completed this and learned how to do this, you can apply this to any search API. So let's start to build this out now from scratch. So we're going to have an overall search component. So this is going to be the data in here to initialize this. And inside of here, we're pretty much going to look at what we looked at before. We're going to have a query, and we're going to have a set of results that come back from that API. We're also going to have a perform search method, which of course will perform the search, and then we can hook up an input just down here to start typing into. We'll get rid of the name and ID just for now because we're playing around, but let's use Xmodel to hook that query up. Now let's look at the status that we saw earlier. As we type, it tells us what we're searching for. So we're going to go ahead and just create a paragraph in here. We're only going to show that on the condition that the query length is filled. So we'll just say query length. And let's say your search for X returned X or Y results. So we can fill in the X here. That's pretty straightforward because we already have the query. So let's go ahead and use X text here to pass the query in. And that should be enough. Let's go over and check it out. So when I type Alpine.js, you can see that automatically updates. Now we don't have any know how many results we've got at the moment because we've not actually sending this request across. But of course, what we can do is we can still go ahead and use results.length. At the moment, that's just going to be 0. So I can go ahead and start typing again and we just see 0 results, which is fine for now. So let's look at actually performing the search here. I'm just going to grab the HackNU's search API over from my notes, which is the following. And this uses Algolia. And the search takes in a query, which we can just assign in here from the query that we have. So that's pretty much what we want. Let's go ahead and use native JavaScript fetch to grab these results. So let's paste this in. The query, of course, we're going to replace out with the query that we get back into perform search that we saw in the last part. And then once that request comes back, we can take the response and we can make sure we have that back as JSON. And then once that has finished, we can go ahead and assign that to our results. And that makes it really easy to iterate through. So once them results come back, we go ahead and set our results to results.hit. Now let's just take a look at this first of all. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these 2 lines just so we're completely clear. And let's see what happens when we perform the search. Of course, we need a watcher to watch that query. So let's go ahead and say watch. Let's watch that query. When we get that query back from there, which we can add into here, we can go ahead and call this perform search and pass the query in. Let's just keep an eye on our network tab just to make sure that this request is actually going through. So let's search Alpine.js and you can see sure enough, we are making a huge number of requests to that API. We're going to look at debouncing this in a bit, but let's get this working first of all. So these are the hits. So we get back this object here and the hits contain objects for each of the results. So that's why a little bit earlier we used the following, and that will bring back them hits and assign it to our results. Great. So let's go ahead and try this out now. We're going to go ahead and search for Alpine.js and you can see sure enough we get 20 results. Now this is limited to 20 results. We could change that, but if we search for something a little bit more specific, Alpine.js A, B, C, you can see that the results do go down. So that still works. Okay, so let's go ahead and output the results just under this paragraph. We're going to create a div just to wrap this. You'll probably have some styling on there. And we now want to iterate through each of the results. We know that to do that, we need a template element. And then on this, we use x4 result in results. Now remember, we need to key this. We looked at this earlier and the reason that we should. So we're going to go ahead and use result and object ID. So that exists within that payload that we get back. If we just perform a search really quickly, we just come down here to each of the results. We get an object ID. So we can use that to uniquely identify each of these in this iteration. So let's create a div out here for each of our results. We'll create a h4, use xtext in here, and we'll say result.title. And again, just to find these out, you just want to look inside of each of the results that we get back. And then an anchor maybe to click through to this result. So inside of this anchor, we want to display the URL perhaps. So let's say result URL, but we also want to bind the href to that. So we can say xbind href result URL. Great. So let's go over and try this out. Let's search for Alpine.js and there we go. There are our results. And of course we can just click through now. That's going to go through to the link that we expected. So let's focus on a couple more things. The first thing I want to do is search for, say, Alpine.js and then get rid of this. And you can see that by passing in an empty query, we get a list of results and I'm not sure how these are kind of ordered. So what we want to do is preferably get rid of these if there are no query or if there is no query. So what we can do is inside of this watcher, now we're doing this directly in here, we can not perform the search if the query is empty. So let's go ahead and check for an empty string in that query. And if that's the case, we can just reset the results back to an empty array and then just return so we don't go ahead and perform that query again. Let's go over and check this out. I'm going to search for Alpine.js, then I'm going to get rid of it and our results disappear. And more importantly, we don't perform an empty search. Now, because the HackNU search runs on Algolia, it doesn't matter if you are making all of these requests. Algolia is fast enough to allow you to have real instant search like this. But if, for example, you didn't want to send a request for every single character you type, you can use a debounce on the input. Let's go down and check this out. Here's our input. and we're using X model in here to hook this up. What we can actually do is, rather than update the query value in our component for every time we type, we can actually use debounce on this. Let's check this out and see what it does. So I'm going to go ahead and start typing Alpine. Notice it's just made one request. Debounce, if you're not familiar with it, allows a slight delay in between typing. So if I was to type really slowly, that will send a request for every single character. But if I type really quickly, or my normal typing speed, it will have that slight delay before it picks up on the new value. So we can adjust this by using another dot and then choosing the milliseconds that we want to use here. 200 is about right for search. So I can start typing Alpine, and you can see it has sent a few requests, and I did a backspace there, but we're sending significantly less requests. So if you're sending a request to your own API and you want to limit how this updates or how many requests are actually sent, debounce is your friend, and you just use that on the model. So in not too long, we've created out a search experience that hits an API and brings back and displays the results. Of course, we've not styled it up, but I'll leave that up to you. Okay, let's get our snippets and steps set up in the database, ready for the next part where we're going to look at actually creating a snippet. So of course, the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and make a model with Artisan, and I'm going to call this snippet, and we're going to generate a migration alongside of that. We can do the same thing while we're here for each of the steps as well, just so we have them available. And if we just come over to that create snippets table migration, we can just start to fill this in. So this is going to be really simple. It's going to belong to a user, of course. So let's go ahead and create an integer in here for that user ID. Let's make this unsigned, and let's make this an index, or give this an index as well. What we'll also do for each of the snippets, we'll give these a UUID, so they can be identified uniquely, not by their incrementing ID. We'll still keep the incrementing ID, but of course we don't want to reveal how many snippets we have in the database, so we'll keep that as a UUID. We'll create a string as well, which will just be the title. Now this will be nullable, really importantly, because when we first create a snippet, this will be null until it's filled in on the client side, and then it's stored. We'll also keep our timestamps in there as well. Now we'll also go ahead and add in a foreign key for user ID. This means that if the user is deleted, all the user snippets will be deleted as well. So we're going to say references ID on users table. And then we'll say, really importantly, when a user is deleted, we want to cascade and delete all snippets. This just adds referential integrity. So if you're working with a database client that supports this, you can just click through onto these. It depends on how you're managing this, but we basically cannot create a snippet with a user ID that doesn't exist. Okay, so let's go over to our steps table. This is going to be very similar. We're going to still have a UUID in here, but this will just relate to a snippet ID instead. So let's grab the UUID and the title. And in fact, we can also grab the user ID and we can just switch that over. I'm just being a little bit lazy here. So this is going to relate to a snippet ID. Again, that's going to be unsigned in an index. We're going to have a UUID for each of these. We're going to have a title for each of these. But what we're also going to have is a piece of text, which will be the body of the step. That will also be nullable as well, because when we create a new step, we don't necessarily have any content in there. And we can go ahead and grab this foreign key constraint in here as well and say that this references the snippet ID on the snippets table. And of course, when we delete a snippet, we want to delete all of the steps as well. Okay, so there's one last thing that we need for a step, and that is an order. So let's go and create out an integer in here, and we'll set that order. And we're going to set this to unsigned, and we're going to give this an index as well, because of course we're going to be ordering by the order that we specify for the steps. So to make this a little bit faster, we give that an index. So I think we've got everything we need now. If we just head over and run PHP Artisan migrate, that should be good. So we've got now, if we just head over to our database, we've got our snippets and our steps ready to go, and we can start to, in the next part, look at creating a snippet, which we're also going to handle over on the client side. So let's get a snippet created, and then we'll look at how we kind of edit each of these snippets details, edit the steps, and slowly bring this together. So we're now going to cover refs, which are a way to pinpoint an element within a component so you can reference it basically. A ref stands for reference. It's an incredibly simple concept, but to make this a little bit more fun, we're going to go ahead and create a file chooser, which is just a native HTML element. And then when we choose an image, this renders a preview of the image. So this is really great for things like previewing an image before you upload it, specifically for avatars in this case. So over to the code, let's look at the basics of refs before we dive into that example. Let's create out a simple component in here, and let's just create any element inside of here. It doesn't matter, it can be a div, an input, really doesn't matter. So I'm just going to put some text in here just so we can see something on the page. And inside of our xinit method, or a method inside of xdata, we're going to go ahead and access this element and console log it out. So let's go ahead and say console log. Now we want to reference this item, regardless of what it is, it doesn't matter. Now to do that, we could say document.getElementById. We could attach an ID to this if we wanted to. If you did want to do that and say greeting, you could easily do that by getElementById and greeting. And that would actually give you that out. Let's give that a refresh, and there we go, we get the element. But this is a little bit cumbersome, so instead what we can do, instead of assigning this an ID, we can say xref. Now that's going to reference that by its name that you've given here. So now what we can do is instead say refs greeting, like so. Let's go over, give that a refresh, we get exactly the same thing. Now refs contain any of the refs that you've created in here, so let's just go ahead and create another one in here and just change that to another. And if we console log out refs, we get an object with each of them in there. So we can have as many of these as we need. This can be really useful for not only the example that we're about to look at, but for an example, if you had an input that you wanted to be auto-selected within a modal where the user doesn't interact with the modal before it's opened, we looked at the example of modals earlier, you could assign a ref to this and just say input, and then when that modal gets opened, you could say refs input, and then focus, for example. So when that modal gets opened, this automatically gets focused, like so. I've just refreshed the page again. So you can use this for pretty much anything, but let's go ahead and look at that example of the image preview, which I think is a really cool example to look at with Alpine. So we're going to go and create out a form here, and let's go ahead and add some data to this to initialize this component. Let's pull this down, and inside of here we want to store the image preview for whichever image we select. By default, that's just going to be null. We can create an input type of file inside of here, and that's going to be where we select that. So we're going to need to watch for that changing. So we're going to need to watch for this having a new image being selected, or file in general being selected, and then do something with it. So for this, what we're going to do is attach an event handler. We've not looked at this specific event yet, but again, it works in exactly the same as any JavaScript event on change, which we use for files. And we're going to go ahead and call a preview image method. Let's grab that and create that method just up in here, and let's just console log out changed, just so we know that this is working. So let's go ahead and choose that file that we had before, and there we go, we get changed. So what we can do now is take this image from here and we can create a preview for it. To do that, we're going to use xref, and we're going to define that as image so we can easily access it directly from inside of here. We could of course use the event that we get through. We actually get an event through in here. Let's just log on that event just so we can see what we mean. And if we just select that image again, we get the event through here, and we do have the target. You could do that, but we're going to go ahead and roll with the xref in this example. In fact, let's bring that event back in because I think it's going to be a bit easier to do it in this way. Let's go ahead and create out a reader, which is a new file reader instance within JavaScript. And we're going to go ahead and set an onload event for when that gets loaded, or something gets loaded into it. So we have an event through inside of here, and we're going to say image preview, and we're going to assign that to the result from that event. In fact, we don't need this event just here. We can use the one that we get back from onload. So now that we have our event listener, let's go ahead and say reader, read as data URL. I think it's capital RL. We'll find out in a minute. And then we're going to go ahead and, from our refs, grab the image ref, which is this input, and then go ahead and grab from the files the first file, because we're just allowing one file to be uploaded. So if we just go ahead and console log this, and I'll run through this in a moment if it doesn't make sense, and get rid of all of this stuff. Let's just see what that gives us. So let's choose a file here, and there we go. So we've got that file inside of there, which we can render out as a preview using the file reader. If you're not familiar, what this will do is it will create a file reader. Ignore onload for now. It will go ahead and read that file as a data URL. And when that happens, this is our callback. So this callback here will be run. It will set the image preview that we have up here to the result from that image preview. So what we should now have, if we just output a span with just xtext for now as the image preview, we should get that result back in there. It's not going to look great at the moment, but we can figure that out. There we go. So we get the image here as a string, which we can put directly into an image tag. So with this, what we can now do is use a template. We can use an xif. Remember, we don't want to actually render anything out yet if that's the case. So we're going to use xif rather than xshow. And we're going to say image preview. So if the image preview exists, then inside of here, we can just create out some kind of wrapper, have an image in here, and we can bind in the source. So we can use xbind, bind that in to the image preview, which is that data URL that we got back. And of course, you'd probably want an alt tag in there for accessibility. Let's just add a inline style to this since we're not using much CSS here, and just set that to a width of 200 pixels, and we should be good. So now let's go over and preview this. Choose a file. That's going to go ahead and read that data in, and I'm just going to give that a hard refresh and try again. Let's choose that file, and there we go. So we get a preview of our image, which we can then go ahead and submit through and do whatever else we need to. So this could technically exist as a normal form that you're not sending through necessarily as an API request, but you're sending through on a normal page. So all we're doing is sprinkling in this functionality to preview the image before the user goes ahead and submits the form in the normal way. For example, you would probably have a method in here of post, and you might have an action going through to some kind of profile information URL. So that would actually submit that file through as normal because you have the input in there, but we've just sprinkled Alpine in to preview the image before that gets sent over. So there we go, a quick example of how we can use refs to reference any element. That's pretty much it for refs. That's all it does. Pinpoint what you want this to be called, and you can access it using this refs object anywhere inside of your Alpine component.